call of the moon, the dimly lit office of Spectral Seekers Paranormal Investigations buzzed with a low hum of anticipation. A flickering neon sign in the window cast a pale blue glow over the mismatched furniture, and the walls, lined with framed photos of ghostly apparitions and unexplained phenomena. In the center of the room, a round table was covered in an assortment of documents, digital devices, and cups of cold coffee. The team sat around the table, their expressions ranging from excitement to skepticism. At the head of the table, Alex Mercer, the team's leader, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, studying the faces around him. Alex was known for his logical mind and his relentless determination to uncover the truth, no matter how bizarre or outlandish the claim. He ran a hand through his short, dark hair, glancing at the laptop screen in front of him, which displayed a grainy, paused video. "All right, everyone, let's get down to business," Alex said, his voice carrying the weight of authority and skepticism that made him both respected and frustrating to work with. "We've all heard the rumors about Wolfbane Woods. Ghosts, monsters, people vanishing without a trace. This place has been the talk of urban legends for decades, but now we have something a bit more concrete." He pressed play on the laptop, and the room went silent. The screen flickered to life, showing shaky footage from a handheld camera. The video, taken by a group of campers, was dark, lit only by the faint glow of their flashlight beams. The trees loomed like skeletal fingers in the night. In the background, the sound of heavy breathing and nervous laughter could be heard. Suddenly, the camera jerked, and a blurry figure darted between the trees, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. The image was indistinct, more like a smear of shadow than anything tangible, but there was an undeniable shape, something hunched, something that seemed more beast than man. "Did you see that?" came a panicked voice from the video, followed by a quick, frightened exclamation. The camera swung wildly, capturing only darkness, before the footage abruptly ended in a hiss of static. Alex paused the video and looked around at his team. "That's the best look we've got at whatever's out there," he said, his tone a mix of disbelief and intrigue. "Some say it's just a bear. Others think it's a hoax, but whatever it is, it's gotten people talking. And more importantly, it's stirred up some fear." Nina, the team's tech expert, with her sharp eyes and ever-present notebook, leaned forward, pushing her glasses up her nose. "I did a bit of digging," she said, flipping through her notes. "This isn't the first time Wolfbane Woods has had strange sightings. There are reports going back centuries, 1600s to be exact. People claimed to see a beast with burning eyes stalking the woods. Others reported hearing howls that sent chills through their bones, even in the middle of summer. And then there are the disappearances. People who went in and were never seen again." Nina slid a yellowed newspaper clipping across the table. The headline read, "Local hunter vanishes in Wolfbane Woods. Only his boots found near an ancient stone circle." Next to it, she placed a faded photograph of a misty, moonlit forest with a blurred, indistinct shape in the background. "That's the stone circle," she continued. "Locals say it's cursed. Supposedly, it's some kind of burial site or ritual ground, but no one really knows for sure." Daniel, the team's historian and folklore enthusiast, nodded in agreement. "I've been going through the testimonials," he said, tapping a thick stack of papers. "People have been seeing weird things in those woods for years. Strange lights, ghostly figures, even hearing voices that aren't there. And then there's the creature sightings. Some say it's a werewolf. Others think it's a skinwalker. The stories are all over the place. But they all agree on one thing. Something is out there, and it's not friendly." Mia, the team's newest member and a former journalist with a nose for mystery, glanced at the video again. "So, what's our plan?" she asked, her voice steady, but her eyes showing a hint of nervousness. "We're not just going in there to debunk some blurry footage, are we?" Alex smiled faintly, appreciating her directness. "No, Mia, we're not. We're going in with everything we've got. Full equipment, thermal cameras, EVP recorders, motion sensors, the works. If there's something in those woods, we'll find it. And if it's just a bunch of kids playing a prank, well, we'll expose that too." He turned to the large map pinned on the wall behind him, marked with red circles and notes. "We'll head out at dusk tomorrow," he continued. "We'll set up camp near the stone circle, where most of the sightings have been reported. We need to cover as much ground as possible and stay alert. If the woods are really as twisted as they say, we're going to have to be careful not to get separated. We stick together, follow the plan, and see what we find." The team nodded in agreement, a mix of excitement and anxiety in their eyes. They had faced haunted houses, abandoned hospitals, and forgotten cemeteries before. But this felt different. There was something about Wolfbane Woods that seemed to pulse with a life of its own, something that felt old and angry. Nina packed up her equipment, checking each device meticulously. Daniel gathered his research, stuffing the papers into his worn leather satchel. Mia readied her camera and voice recorder, and Alex went over the plan once more, his mind racing with possibilities. As they prepared to leave the office, the air was thick with a sense of foreboding. None of them could shake the feeling that this investigation might be their most dangerous yet. Alex paused at the door, looking back at his team. "Remember," he said quietly, "whatever happens out there, keep your wits about you. We don't know what we're dealing with, but we're not going in blind." With that, they stepped out into the night, the shadows of the city swallowing them up as they headed toward the unknown depths of Wolfbane Woods, toward whatever waited in the darkness, where the ancient stones lay, buried beneath centuries of fallen leaves and secrets whispered on the wind. And somewhere in those woods, something stirred, as if sensing their approach, something hungry. The night was thick and moonless, a black shroud hanging over Wolfbane Woods. The towering trees loomed like silent sentinels, their skeletal branches intertwining to blot out the sky. A cold wind whispered through the underbrush, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves. In the darkness, the ancient stone circle sat half-buried, its weathered stones jutting from the ground like jagged teeth. Not far from the circle, a small tent stood among the trees. Its fabric rippled in the breeze, a lone splash of colour in the sea of shadows. Inside, Ben and Rachel huddled together on their sleeping bags, the dim glow of a battery-powered lantern casting flickering shadows on the tent walls. They had come to Wolfbane Woods, seeking solitude, a weekend escape from the noise and chaos of their everyday lives. But now, as the night grew colder and the forest grew darker, a strange unease settled over them. "Did you hear that?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves outside. She sat up, her eyes wide and alert, listening intently. For a moment, there was only silence, the deep, oppressive silence of a forest that seemed to hold its breath. Ben shook his head, trying to sound dismissive, though his own heart was pounding. "It's just the wind," he muttered, adjusting his sleeping bag. "These old woods make a lot of noise. Nothing to worry about." But Rachel wasn't convinced. She stared at the tent flap, her fingers clutching the fabric tightly. Then, from somewhere beyond the thin walls of their shelter, there came a low, guttural growl. The sound was faint at first, almost like a distant animal's call, but it grew louder, more menacing, resonating with an unnatural vibration that made her skin crawl. That doesn't sound like the wind," Rachel said, her voice trembling now. Ben froze, his breath catching in his throat. He sat up, his eyes darting around the tent. The growl seemed to echo all around them, a deep, throaty rumble that sent a chill down his spine. Maybe it's, a bear? Ben suggested, though even he didn't believe it. The growl wasn't like any animal he'd ever heard. It was too low, too resonant, as if the very earth itself were growling. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching on the leaves outside. Heavy and uneven, they moved around the tent, circling, getting closer. Ben and Rachel held their breath, their eyes locked on the tent walls, as if expecting something to tear through at any moment. Rachel grabbed Ben's arm, her grip tight enough to hurt. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing to a shadow moving across the tent wall. A tall, distorted shape, impossibly large, loomed outside, casting a dark silhouette against the dim light of the lantern. Its outline was twisted and hunched, with what seemed to be elongated limbs and sharp claw-like hands. Ben felt his heart hammering in his chest. "That's not a bear," he whispered back, his voice barely a breath. The shadow paused, as if sensing their fear, and then began to move again, slowly, deliberately. Another growl, louder this time, seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath them. Rachel's eyes widened with terror. What is it?" she stammered, unable to tear her gaze away from the shadow. The shape shifted, its form rippling as though it were made of smoke and darkness, and then another set of footsteps joined the first, a lighter, quicker pattern that seemed to dance around the tent. Shadows began to multiply, moving faster now, darting between the trees, their forms blurring into an ever-shifting mass. Shapes that resembled twisted, elongated bodies with impossibly long fingers, heads that seemed to twist and turn at unnatural angles. Whispers began to fill the air, indistinct and overlapping, like 100 voices murmuring just beyond comprehension. Ben's breath came in short gasps, panic taking hold. "This isn't real," he muttered to himself, gripping his head. "It's just in our heads. It's just..." The tent suddenly shook, as if struck by something heavy. The lantern flickered, casting frantic, jumping shadows. A deep, bone-chilling howl cut through the whispers, a sound so unnatural and guttural that it seemed to pierce their very souls. The air felt colder, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath them. Rachel screamed, scrambling back against the far side of the tent. "We have to go, now," she cried, her voice filled with pure terror. Her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely pull on her boots. Ben nodded, unable to speak. His eyes were wide, his face pale as he grabbed the lantern and fumbled with the tent zipper. The shadows outside seemed to close in, their forms merging into a solid wall of darkness. The footsteps grew louder, a rapid pounding that filled his ears, drowning out all rational thought. Finally, the zipper came free, and Ben burst out of the tent, pulling Rachel with him. They stumbled into the cold night, their breaths coming in frantic puffs of mist. The forest around them was alive with movement, shadows shifting and darting between the trees. The growls and whispers seemed to echo from every direction, surrounding them. "This way!" Ben shouted, grabbing Rachel's hand and pulling her into the trees. They ran, hearts pounding, branches slapping against their faces, their footsteps loud on the forest floor. Behind them, the shadows seemed to stretch and grow, twisting like living smoke, always just a step behind. They didn't look back. They couldn't. The terror was too much, too overwhelming. They ran blindly through the forest, driven only by the primal instinct to survive, to escape whatever horror was closing in around them. After what felt like an eternity, they broke through a thick cluster of trees and into a small clearing. Rachel gasped for breath, her eyes wide and wild. What was that?" she stammered, clutching Ben's arm as if her life depended on it. Ben shook his head, unable to answer. His mind was racing, His thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. I don't know. But we need to get out of here. Now. Without another word, they turned and fled, leaving their tent, their gear, and everything else behind in the darkness of Wolfbane Woods. The forest seemed to watch them go, its shadows rippling like water, disturbed by an unseen force. And somewhere, deep within those cursed woods, the howl of something ancient and evil echoed once more, a sound that carried on the wind like a promise of death. The dirt road leading into Wolfbane Woods was narrow and overgrown, flanked on both sides by dense towering trees that stretched upward like a canopy of skeletal fingers. The sun was beginning its slow descent in the sky, casting long shadows over the forest floor, but there was still enough daylight left to navigate the twisting path. The Spectral Seekers' paranormal investigations van bumped and jolted as it made its way deeper into the woods, its headlights occasionally flickering from the uneven terrain. Inside, the team sat in a tense silence, each of them lost in thought, their eyes scanning the encroaching forest. Alex Mercer, behind the wheel, squinted ahead, his expression focused. "All right, according to the GPS we should be close," he said. "Keep your eyes open. We're looking for the stone circle." Nina, sitting in the passenger seat, nodded and glanced at the map in her lap. "There should be a clearing just up ahead," she replied, tracing a path with her finger. "That's where the most recent sightings were reported." As the van rounded a bend, they saw it, a small clearing off to the right. Alex pulled the van to a stop, and the team climbed out, stretching their legs and taking in the surroundings. The air was cool, the scent of earth and pine heavy in the air. The trees whispered as the wind rustled through their leaves. Daniel noticed something just beyond the clearing. "Hey, look over there," he called out, pointing to a small, abandoned tent that stood among the trees, its fabric fluttering gently in the breeze. Mia frowned, adjusting her camera strap over her shoulder. "Looks like someone left in a hurry," she said, her tone cautious. "Wonder who it belonged to." "Probably some campers who got spooked," Sam suggested with a shrug, his camera already rolling as he zoomed in on the tent. "Can't say I blame them. This place has a way of getting under your skin." Alex waved them onward. "We'll check it out later if we need to. First, we find the stone circle and set up base. Daylight's fading fast, and I want us ready before it gets dark." The group moved deeper into the woods, their footsteps crunching on fallen leaves and twigs. After a few minutes of walking, they reached the stone circle. The ancient stones jutted out of the ground like jagged teeth, their surfaces covered in strange, indecipherable symbols. Moss and lichen clung to the rock faces, giving them a sickly, greenish hue. "This is it," Alex said, glancing around. "The stone circle. Everyone, let's start setting up." Nina quickly unpacked her equipment, laying out the thermal cameras, motion sensors, and EVP recorders. Daniel began marking the perimeter with chalk, setting up small cameras on tripods to cover all angles of the clearing. Mia walked around, capturing B-roll footage of the eerie surroundings, while Sam set up a central camera on the largest stone, its lens trained on the center of the circle. They worked in silence for a while, each focused on their tasks. As they finished setting up, Alex gathered the team near their temporary base, a small tent they'd set up just outside the stone circle. "All right, let's go over what we know," Alex began, leaning against one of the larger stones. "Why do we think these sightings are happening here, at this specific spot?" Daniel, ever the historian, cleared his throat and stepped forward, holding a stack of notes. "I did some digging into the local legends," he said, flipping through his papers. "This place, Wolfbane Woods, has a long and dark history. The sightings go back centuries, but the stories are always similar. Strange noises, ghostly apparitions, monstrous shapes in the dark. He paused, looking around at the old stones before continuing. But there's one legend that stands out. The legend of the cursed werewolf. Maya raised an eyebrow. A werewolf? Like an actual werewolf? Daniel nodded. Yes. According to the old stories, there was once a powerful werewolf clan that roamed these woods, cursed with an insatiable hunger and a savage, uncontrollable rage. They were said to be descended from a single, original werewolf, cursed by an ancient force. But as time went on, the bloodline grew thin, and the last of their kind was hunted down by a powerful witch, a woman named Isolde Blackthorn. Nina, adjusting a thermal camera, glanced up. I've read about her, she said. She was known for her mastery of dark magic, right? Exactly, Daniel continued. The story goes that Isolde used a forbidden ritual to bind the last werewolf of that bloodline in these woods, trapping it within this very stone circle. She created a prison from dark magic to contain the beast, using the stones as a barrier that no mortal could cross. Sam, filming the discussion, looked intrigued. So, the stones are like, what, magical chains? More or less, Daniel agreed. The werewolf's physical form was bound, but its spirit, its essence, or whatever you want to call it, is said to have been trapped within the woods. It's been said that the werewolf's ghost roams these woods, looking for a way to break free from the prison and take physical form once again. Alex folded his arms, looking thoughtful. And the recent sightings, the shadows, the sounds. You think that's the spirit? Daniel nodded. Possibly. It's said that the beast grows restless, that it feeds on fear and darkness. And there's one more thing. According to legend, the prison can only be broken by someone of its own blood, a descendant of the cursed werewolf clan. Mia shivered slightly, despite the daylight. So, you're saying a long-lost ancestor might come here and accidentally release the beast? Exactly, Daniel replied. And until then, it's trapped, but its power is still strong enough to affect those who come too close, to create illusions, projections, to draw people into the woods, hoping they'll disturb the prison and let it loose. The team fell silent for a moment, the weight of the legend settling over them like a dark cloud. The shadows of the trees seemed to lengthen, stretching towards the stone circle, as if reaching for the ancient stones. All right, Alex said finally, breaking the tension. We've got our cameras, our sensors, and our equipment set up. If anything is out here, we'll capture it, and if there's any truth to these legends, well, we'll be the ones to find out. Nina checked her devices again, making sure everything was in working order. We should have enough power to run through the night, she said, and we've got backup batteries if we need them. Sam grinned, his camera still rolling. Hope we get something good, he said, half joking, half nervous. I don't know about you guys, but I wouldn't mind catching a werewolf on film. The team chuckled, but there was an underlying tension in their laughter. They all felt it, the sense that something was watching them, just beyond the edge of the clearing. Something old, something dark, something hungry. As the last light of day began to fade, the spectral seekers prepared for the long night ahead, unaware of just how close they were to awakening an ancient evil that had lain dormant for centuries, waiting for this very moment to unleash its fury once more. Mia stood at the edge of the stone circle, her fingers gently tracing the rough, moss-covered surface of one of the ancient stones. Her eyes were fixed on the runes, etched into the weathered rock, their meanings obscured by centuries of erosion and decay. The forest around her was growing dimmer as dusk settled in, but she seemed oddly focused, almost entranced by the stones. Daniel, noticing her lingering at the edge of the circle, walked over, his footsteps crunching softly on the forest floor. "Hey, Mia, you've been staring at those stones for a while," he said, his voice light but curious. "Find anything interesting?" Mia blinked, as if snapping out of a trance. "No, nothing really," she replied slowly. "Just thinking." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "About what?" Mia shrugged, her fingers still grazing the stone. "Just about the curse," she murmured, her tone distant, "and what it must have been like. To be trapped here, alone." Daniel chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "Well, if the legend is true, that werewolf wasn't exactly alone, more like locked up tight, so it wouldn't tear through the countryside." Mia's smile widened, her eyes flicking up to the sky. The moon was rising, pale and full, casting a soft glow over the clearing. For a moment, a strange expression crossed her face, a flicker of something like amusement or satisfaction. "Yes, locked up tight," she whispered, almost to herself. Before Daniel could press her further, Sam's voice cut through the air. "Hey, Mia! Daniel, any luck over there?" He was setting up a thermal camera on the far side of the circle, adjusting the lens to catch every possible angle. Mia turned back to Daniel, her smile still lingering. "Let's go join them," she suggested, her tone almost too cheerful. She moved away from the stones with a fluid grace, her eyes darting briefly back to them, a glint of that same strange light in her gaze. Daniel noticed, but shrugged it off. "Yeah, let's see what the others have found," he agreed, walking beside her. "You know, these stones give me the creeps. They say they were used in rituals. Dark ones." Mia nodded, still smiling faintly. "Oh? You sound like you know a bit about that kind of thing, Daniel." He laughed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I guess you could say it runs in the family." "My mum, she was into witchcraft, or at least she thought she was. Kept a lot of old books, herbs, crystals. Believed in energies and all that." Mia's smile grew a little wider, her eyes never leaving Daniel's face. "Interesting," she murmured. "Maybe she would have liked these stones." Daniel shrugged again, feeling a little uneasy under Mia's gaze. "Maybe. Or maybe she would have run the other way. Even she had her limits, you know." Mia nodded slowly, her eyes drifting back to the stones. "And what about you, Daniel? Do you have any limits?" Before he could answer, Alex and Nina arrived, both looking slightly frustrated. "Nothing on the sensor so far," Alex reported, glancing around the clearing. "No thermal signatures, no EVP readings. It's like this place is dead." Nina sighed, adjusting her glasses. "I thought I heard something earlier, but it was probably just an animal. No concrete evidence yet." Sam joined them, lugging a heavy camera over his shoulder. "Well, it's still early," he said optimistically. "Plenty of time for something spooky to happen." Mia's eyes sparkled in the dim light. "We'll just have to keep looking," she suggested. "Maybe we should split up, cover more ground." Alex nodded. "Good idea. We'll pair off. Mia, you stick with Daniel. You two seem to have some good theories about this place. Nina and I will take the south side. Sam, you take the north with the thermal camera." The group agreed, and soon they were splitting off into pairs, each moving in different directions. Mia stayed close to Daniel, her smile never fading. As they moved deeper into the woods, she kept glancing back at the stone circle, her expression unreadable. Meanwhile, on the south side of the woods, Alex and Nina moved slowly, their eyes scanning the trees for any signs of movement. The forest was growing darker by the minute, the shadows lengthening and twisting into strange shapes. "Did you hear that?" Nina whispered suddenly, her hand tightening on her flashlight. Alex paused, listening. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves, then a faint, distant noise, like footsteps, heavy and slow. Probably just an animal, Alex muttered, though his voice was tense. Let's keep moving. But as they continued, the sound seemed to follow them, growing louder, closer. Nina turned suddenly, her flashlight beam catching a glimpse of something moving just at the edge of her vision, a dark shape, darting between the trees. "Did you see that?" she hissed, her heart racing. Alex turned, scanning the darkness. "See what?" Nina shook her head. I don't know. Maybe it was just a trick of the light." On the north side, Sam was setting up his camera, trying to focus the lens on a spot where he thought he'd seen movement. He adjusted the thermal display, frowning at the static that crackled across the screen. "Come on, give me something," he muttered to himself. Suddenly, he heard a low, guttural sound, a growl that seemed to come from deep within the woods. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly he turned, the camera's night vision catching a flicker of movement in the underbrush. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling slightly. "Is someone there?" No answer, just the sound of leaves crunching, twigs snapping, and that low growl growing louder. Back with Mia and Daniel, the two of them were walking near the edge of the stone circle. Daniel was talking, trying to keep his nerves in check. "You know, I'm not really sure about all this werewolf stuff," he admitted, "but there's definitely something strange about these woods." Mia nodded, still with that faint smile. Oh, there's something here all right," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the wind. "Something very old and very angry." Daniel glanced at her, noticing the odd look in her eyes. "Mia, are you okay?" he asked, concern creeping into his voice. She turned to him, her smile growing wider. "I'm just excited," she said softly. "Excited to see what happens next." Daniel shivered, feeling a chill run down his spine. The moon had risen fully now, casting an eerie light over the clearing. The stones seemed to pulse with a faint, almost imperceptible glow. He looked back at Mia, and for a moment he thought he saw something in her eyes, something dark, something knowing. Before he could say anything, the forest around them seemed to come alive with movement. Shadows flitted between the trees, accompanied by strange whispering sounds and distant growls. The night was filled with a sense of unease, of something lurking just out of sight. "We should find the others," Daniel said quickly, glancing around nervously. "Stick together." Mia nodded, her smile never wavering. "Yes," she agreed. "Let's see what the night brings." And as they moved deeper into the woods, the shadows seemed to follow them, creeping closer, as if drawn by some unseen force, waiting for the moment when darkness would finally reclaim the cursed grounds of Wolfbane Woods. Mia led Daniel back through the darkening woods, her steps purposeful, almost too eager. The moon hung high in the sky now, casting an eerie, silvery light over the clearing as they approached the ancient stone circle once more. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches intertwining overhead like skeletal fingers. The shadows grew deeper, darker, moving with an unnatural life. "There's no one here yet," Mia said softly, her voice carrying an edge of anticipation. She glanced around the empty clearing, her eyes darting to the stones. Daniel felt a shiver run down his spine, a creeping sense of unease settling in his gut. He looked around, and for a moment he thought he saw shapes moving in the darkness behind Mia. Shadows that twisted and writhed as if alive, curling and uncurling, like smoke caught in an unseen wind. His breath caught in his throat. "Mia, what's happening?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. There was a coldness in the air, a weight pressing down on him, as if the very forest held its breath. Mia turned to face him, and there was something different in her eyes now. A darkness, a hunger that hadn't been there before. "It's time, Daniel," she whispered, her voice low and strangely melodic. "Time for him to be free. For years, we have waited for the right moment, the right alignment of the moon and the bloodline, a descendant of the witch who imprisoned him, and a descendant of the lichen curse." Daniel felt his blood run cold. He took a step back, shaking his head. "What are you talking about, Mia? What do you mean, we?" His eyes flicked to the stones, which seemed to pulse with faint, dull light, a glow that grew stronger with each passing second. Mia's smile widened, her eyes narrowing. "You don't understand, do you?" she said, almost laughing. "I am one of them, one of the last descendants of those who were cursed to roam these woods as wolves under the blood moon. I have been waiting for this. For you, a descendant of the witch, the blood that binds the curse." Daniel's heart raced, his mind spinning. "Mia, no. This is insane. You're not making any sense." But it was too late. The stones around them began to glow with an ancient, unholy light, a deep, throbbing pulse that seemed to resonate from the very earth. Mia's eyes turned black, completely black, the whites disappearing into an abyssal void. She tilted her head back, a strange, rapturous smile stretching across her face. "Yes, the time has come," she hissed, her voice now a strange, guttural tone. "For centuries, our ancestor has waited. For the prison to weaken, for the blood to spill. Now the moon is full, the lineage is here, and he will rise again." Before Daniel could react, Mia moved with inhuman speed, her hands slashing across his back with a strength that defied her small frame. Pain exploded through Daniel's body, a burning, searing agony as he stumbled forward, gasping. He tried to scream, but the sound was choked in his throat. His blood flowed freely, dark and thick, spilling onto the stones at his feet. Mia's voice rose in a fevered chant. Yes, be free, great ancestor. Be free from your prison of stone and shadow. The blood calls to you, the blood of the witch who bound you. Take it and rise." Daniel collapsed to his knees, clutching at his back, his vision blurring with pain and terror. He looked up, seeing the stones glowing brighter now, pulsing with a light that seemed to draw in the very darkness around them. Shadows swirled like a living mist, converging on the circle, pulled inward by some unseen force. Mia continued to chant, her voice rising higher and higher, her eyes wide and filled with a manic ecstasy. The ground beneath the stones began to tremble, and the air grew thick with a sense of malevolence, an ancient hatred that had waited for centuries to be unleashed. The stones pulsed faster, brighter, their light becoming almost blinding. And then, in the center of the circle, a figure began to materialize, slowly at first, a faded, shadowy outline, like smoke forming into a shape. It was hunched, twisted, its limbs long and sinewy, its form shifting and unstable as if it were caught between worlds. Daniel gasped, his blood pooling around him, his body trembling with fear and pain. He watched in horror as the figure in the center of the circle grew more defined, its shadowy edges hardening into solid form. The air around it seemed to ripple, distorting with heat and darkness. The shape took on the form of a massive, hulking creature, a werewolf, but unlike any that could be imagined. Its body was covered in matted, coarse fur, black as night, its muscles rippling beneath its skin. Its face was elongated into a snarling snout, its jaws filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth that dripped with a dark, oily saliva. Its eyes were a hellish, fiery red, burning with a fury that had been contained for centuries. The creature's claws, long and jagged, flexed as if testing their freedom, and a low, guttural growl rumbled from its throat, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath them. It was massive, towering over the stones, its form seeming to absorb the light around it, casting long, terrifying shadows across the clearing. It sniffed the air, its nostrils flaring, and its eyes fell upon Daniel, who lay bleeding at the edge of the circle. A growl rumbled deep in its chest, and it bared its teeth, a sound that was half snarl, half roar. It was a sound filled with anger, with a rage that had been building for centuries, an unquenchable thirst for vengeance. Mia laughed, her voice shrill and filled with glee. "Yes, rise, great ancestor. Feel the night air. Taste the fear. Reclaim your dominion. Your time of imprisonment is over." The werewolf threw back its head and howled, a bone-chilling, otherworldly sound that echoed through the forest, sending flocks of birds screeching into the sky. The very trees seemed to shiver with the force of it, their leaves rustling violently. The creature turned its gaze to Mia, its red eyes narrowing, a look of recognition passing over its snarling face. Mia, still smiling, bowed her head. "I have freed you, Great One," she whispered reverently. "Do as you will." But the beast did not answer. It seemed to sniff the air again, sensing, feeling its surroundings, its mind slowly awakening from centuries of confinement. It was filled with fury, with a wild, unthinking rage. A beast unleashed after centuries, no longer bound by chains of stone or magic. Daniel, bleeding and weak, watched in horror as the creature's form solidified further, its muscles tensing, its claws digging into the earth. He tried to crawl backward, but his strength was failing him. His eyes locked onto the werewolf's, and in that moment he saw nothing but hatred, pure and primal. The werewolf took a step forward, the ground trembling beneath its weight, its growl deepening, louder and louder, until it seemed the entire forest vibrated with its fury. It was free, and it was hungry. Hungry for revenge, for flesh, for blood. After centuries of imprisonment, it would not be denied. And as its savage eyes fell once more upon the stone circle and the cursed ground it had been bound to for so long, its lips pulled back into a snarl, and it leapt forward with a speed and power that defied its massive size, its roar tearing through the night, heralding the terror that was about to be unleashed upon the world once more. The forest was shrouded in darkness as Alex, Nina and Sam rushed back toward the stone circle, their flashlights flickering in the gloom. They had heard the screams, the raw, agonized cry that had ripped through the woods, sending shivers down their spines. Now their hearts pounded with fear and confusion as they sprinted through the trees, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. When they broke through the clearing, they saw him, Daniel, crumpled on the ground near the stones, his body slick with blood. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror and pain. He clutched at his side, blood seeping through his fingers, pooling in around him in a dark, spreading stain. "Daniel!" Nina cried out, rushing to his side, dropping to her knees beside him. "Oh my God! Daniel, what happened?" Daniel coughed, his breath laboured and wet. He tried to speak, his voice a strained whisper. Mia. It was Mia. She did this," he gasped, each word a struggle. She's one of them. Part of the curse. She freed it." Alex knelt beside him, his face pale and his jaw clenched. "Freed what, Daniel? What are you talking about?" "The werewolf," Daniel whispered, his eyes filled with fear. She brought it back. Said it was their great ancestor. I tried to stop her, but she attacked me." "Here." Sam glanced around nervously, his flashlight, darting over the trees and the stones, which still pulsed faintly with that strange, otherworldly glow. "Where is she now?" he asked, his voice shaking. Before Daniel could answer, a voice cut through the darkness, soft and mocking. "Nobody likes a snitch." They all turned, their flashlights swinging toward the source of the voice. There, standing just at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows, was Mia. Her eyes were black as the night, two empty voids that seemed to swallow the light. She smiled, a cold, knowing smile. "Our great ancestor is ready," she whispered, her voice dripping with malevolent glee. "Ready for a game of hide and seek. I suggest you all hide as fast as you can." Before they could react, Mia vanished into the darkness, as if swallowed by the shadows themselves. A bone-chilling howl erupted from the depths of the woods, a sound so deep and primal it seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. It was a howl of hunger, of fury, of a beast newly freed from centuries of imprisonment. Nina gasped, panic flashing in her eyes. "The werewolf! It's coming for us," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "We need to hide. Now." Alex hesitated, looking down at Daniel, who was bleeding heavily, barely able to move. "We can't just leave him here," he shouted. "He needs help." Daniel's eyes were wide, desperate. "Please, help me. Don't leave me." But the terror had already set in. Sam grabbed Nina's arm, pulling her back. "We have to go now," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "If we don't hide, we're dead." Nina looked torn, her eyes darting between Daniel and the darkness encroaching on them. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Daniel," she whispered, her voice choked with guilt. And then they were gone, their footsteps pounding against the forest floor as they fled into the night, their flashlight beams bouncing wildly through the trees. Daniel watched them go, his heart sinking, his body trembling with fear and pain. He tried to move, tried to crawl away from the stone circle, but his strength was fading fast. Every movement sent waves of agony through his body, his blood leaving a dark trail behind him. "Please, don't leave me," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. From the darkness, a shape began to emerge, a massive, hulking form that seemed to grow larger with every step. The werewolf stepped into the moonlight, its eyes blazing with a fierce, blood-red glow. Its snout was curled back in a snarl, exposing rows of jagged, glistening teeth. The creature's body was covered in matted fur, its muscles rippling beneath its skin as it moved with a predatory grace. Daniel's breath hitched in his throat, his heart racing with a terror he had never known. He tried to crawl faster, but his limbs were weak, trembling. The werewolf's growl rumbled through the air, low and menacing, as it stalked closer, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the scent of his blood. Daniel's eyes filled with tears, his voice a hoarse, desperate whisper. "No, please, please." But the werewolf did not stop. It moved slowly, deliberately, savoring the fear that radiated from its prey. Its massive claws dug into the earth with each step, its breath coming in hot, heavy pants that filled the air with mist. Daniel tried to drag himself further, but his body was failing, his strength ebbing away. The werewolf's eyes never left him. Its gaze locked onto his with a terrifying intensity. It crouched low, muscles coiling like springs ready to strike. "Please, no." Daniel whimpered, his voice breaking. With a roar that seemed to split the night, the werewolf lunged, its claws slashing through the air. Daniel screamed, a sound of pure agony, as the creature's claws tore into his flesh. Blood sprayed across the stones, and the werewolf's snarl deepened, a guttural, savage sound of triumph. It bit down, tearing into Daniel with a ferocity born of centuries of imprisonment and hunger. His screams filled the clearing, echoing through the woods, and then they were cut short, leaving only the wet, sickening sounds of the werewolf's feast. The stones pulsed brighter for a moment, as if drinking in the blood that now soaked the earth around them, then began to dim, their glow fading slowly back into the darkness. The forest grew silent once more, save for the heavy, satisfied breathing of the werewolf, its mouth stained with blood, and then, as if sensing that the hunt had only just begun, the werewolf raised its head to the sky and howled, a sound that carried far into the night, a call to the shadows, to the darkness, to the terror that awaited those who dared to linger in the cursed woods of Wolfbane. The forest was alive with shadows and whispers, the moon casting long, twisting beams of silver light that danced between the trees. A heavy mist had begun to roll in from the depths of Wolfbane Woods, curling through the branches and wrapping around the trunks like ghostly tendrils. The air was thick with dread, every sound amplified by the stillness of the night. Alex, Nina and Sam ran blindly through the darkness, their breaths coming in ragged gasps, hearts pounding with terror. They could hear the howls behind them, deep, guttural, and hungry. The werewolf was on the hunt, and they were the prey. "We need to split up," Alex shouted, his voice barely audible over the sound of their frantic footsteps. "It's our only chance." "No," Nina screamed back, panic in her eyes. "We should stay together. We have to." A deafening roar tore through the air, and suddenly the forest exploded with movement. The werewolf crashed through the underbrush, its massive form leaping from the shadows with terrifying speed. It was a blur of fur and claws, its red eyes blazing in the moonlight. Sam, lagging behind, felt a massive force slam into him, knocking him to the ground. He screamed as he rolled over, coming face to face with the beast. Its snout was inches from his face, saliva dripping from its fangs. Its breath was hot and foul, reeking of blood and decay. "No, no, get away!" Sam shrieked, kicking desperately at the creature, but it was no use. The werewolf's claws slashed through the air, raking across his chest with a sickening rip. Blood sprayed into the night, and Sam's scream was cut short as the werewolf bit down, its jaws snapping around his throat. Alex and Nina glanced back, just in time to see Sam's body go limp in the creature's jaws, his lifeless eyes staring up at the moon. The werewolf tossed him aside like a rag doll, eyes blazing with feral hunger. "Run!" Alex shouted, grabbing Nina's arm and pulling her forward. "Don't look back!" They sprinted deeper into the woods, weaving between trees, their breaths ragged and panicked. The werewolf's roar followed them, echoing through the forest like a death knell. Nina could hear its heavy footsteps, pounding against the ground, closing the distance. "Over here!" Alex pulled her sharply to the right, and they dove behind a thick cluster of bushes. They crouched low, trying to control their breathing, their hearts racing so loudly it felt as though they would burst from their chests. For a moment, there was silence. Then they heard it, the slow, deliberate crunch of leaves and twigs under heavy footsteps. The werewolf was moving slowly now, its growl low and rumbling, a sound that vibrated through the air. It was searching, sniffing the air, hunting. Nina's hand gripped Alex's arm so tightly, her knuckles turned white. What do we do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Alex didn't answer. He was staring straight ahead, his eyes wide with fear. "Stay quiet," he mouthed, barely moving his lips. "Don't move. Don't breathe." The werewolf prowled closer, its nostrils flaring, its claws dragging through the underbrush. Its massive head turned slowly, sniffing, its ears twitching as it listened for any sign of movement. Suddenly, a twig snapped under Alex's foot, and the werewolf's head snapped in their direction, its eyes locking onto them with a fierce, predatory intensity. "Run!" Alex yelled, pushing Nina forward. She took off, her legs burning with the effort, her lungs screaming for air. Alex stayed behind for just a moment, trying to draw the creature's attention away. He picked up a rock and hurled it into the darkness, hoping to create a distraction. The werewolf's eyes darted to the sound of the rock, but only for a split second. It turned back, snarling, and launched itself forward. Alex barely had time to move before the beast was upon him. It tackled him to the ground, its claws tearing into his side. He screamed, feeling the hot rush of blood soaking his clothes. "Go, Nina!" he shouted, his voice breaking with pain. "Just go!" Nina hesitated for a moment, tears streaming down her face, but then she turned and ran, knowing she couldn't help him now. She heard Alex's screams echoing behind her, a sound that would haunt her for the rest of her short life. The werewolf's growls grew louder, more frenzied, and then there was silence. Nina knew what it meant. Alex was gone. She kept running, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps, her heart hammering in her chest. She stumbled over roots and rocks, her vision blurring with tears. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees twisting and shifting like they were alive, trapping her in a maze of shadows. Then she heard it, a soft, steady rustling behind her. She dared to glance back, and there it was, moving through the trees with terrifying speed. The werewolf's eyes glowed like hot coals, its breath steaming in the cool night air. It was playing with her, enjoying the chase. No, please, she whimpered, her legs burning with exhaustion. She turned a corner, hoping to find some way out, some shelter, but there was nothing. Only more trees, more shadows, more darkness. She felt a hot breath on her neck, heard the snap of jaws just inches away. She screamed and stumbled, falling to the ground, her hands scraping against the rough bark of a fallen tree. The werewolf was on her in an instant. Its massive paw slammed down on her back, pinning her to the ground. She felt the claws dig into her flesh, and she cried out in pain. "Please, don't," she begged, her voice breaking. But the werewolf had no mercy left, no humanity. It snarled, lowering its head to her ear, and let out a low, guttural growl. Then, with a swift, brutal movement, it bit down on her shoulder, tearing through flesh and bone. Nina's scream was short, sharp, and then there was only the wet sound of tearing flesh. The werewolf stood over her broken body, its fur stained with blood, its eyes still burning with hunger. It lifted its head to the sky and howled, a long, mournful sound that echoed through the forest, a proclamation of its victory. There was one more. The beast turned, its ears twitching, its nostrils flaring, as it picked up the scent of its final prey. Mia stood, watching from the shadows, her black eyes shining with triumph. She smiled as the werewolf moved towards her, slow and deliberate, its jaws stained with blood. "Are you satisfied, great ancestor?" she whispered, her voice a mixture of reverence and madness. "Have you claimed your prize?" The werewolf paused, its head tilting as if considering her. Then it growled, low and deep, and turned away, disappearing into the night, its shadowy form melting into the darkness of Wolfbane Woods. The hunt was over. For now. Mia stood alone in the clearing, the moon casting her shadow, long and thin, across the forest floor. The night was still, the air heavy with the lingering scent of blood and fear. The werewolf had vanished into the depths of Wolfbane Woods, its roars echoing faintly in the distance as it moved deeper into the night, hungry for more. She stepped forward, her black eyes reflecting the cold light of the moon. The stones around her, now silent and dark, seemed to pulse with a fading power. She smiled, a slow, satisfied smile, her lips parting as she began to speak into the darkness, her voice low and filled with a strange, almost hypnotic rhythm. "You wish to know the tale, do you?" she murmured, her voice barely more than a whisper, yet it seemed to carry through the trees, reaching out into the very shadows themselves. "The tale of my great ancestor, the beast who was once feared by all, who was a nightmare, given flesh and form." She stepped closer to the stones, her fingers brushing against their rough surfaces. Long ago, in a time forgotten by most, there was a man, a warrior, fierce and unyielding, a leader of a pack that knew no equal. But he was more than a man. He was a monster, a werewolf born under a blood moon, cursed with an insatiable hunger, with a rage that could never be quenched. Her smile grew wider, her eyes glinting with dark delight. He spread terror wherever he went, his claws stained with the blood of the innocent, his howl a sound that sent shivers through the bravest of souls. He revelled in the fear, the chaos, the darkness. But there were those who feared his power, who sought to end his reign. She paused, her gaze drifting up toward the moon, her voice dropping lower. A witch, powerful and wise, known as Isolde Blackthorn, came to these woods. She saw the havoc my ancestor wreaked, the terror he spread, and she decided that his curse must end. She wielded her magic, ancient and dark, and she devised a plan to bind him, to trap him within a prison of stone and shadow. Mia's voice grew softer, almost reverent. She used the stones, these very stones, and with her incantations, with the blood of a wolf and the power of the moon, she created a seal, a prison from which he could not escape. And so he was bound, trapped within this place, hidden from the world, his fury contained, for a time. She laughed softly, a sound that sent a chill through the air. But curses do not die so easily. And his hatred grew, festering in the dark, feeding on the fear of those who dared to come near. He waited. Oh, how he waited for the right moment, the right blood, the right time. Her eyes narrowed, her expressions fierce. And that time is now. The magic of the old ways is gone, faded from this world like mist in the morning light. The witch is long dead, her power forgotten, and there is no one left who knows the words, the rituals, the spells that might bind him once more. She looked out into the darkness, her voice rising with an almost triumphant fervour. Now he is free, free to spread his terror once again, free to fulfill his vengeance, his destiny, to walk the world as he was meant to, unchained and unstoppable, to unleash a darkness that no one can stand against. Maya's voice softened to a whisper, but her words seemed to echo, carried by the wind. And what can the modern world do against such an ancient force, with its machines and its weapons, its science and its reason? Nothing. Nothing at all. For the old ways are gone, the magic has faded, and all that remains is fear. She stepped back into the shadows, her black eyes glinting one last time. So run, if you can, she said, her voice barely audible. Run while there is still light, while there is still hope. But know this, you cannot hide from what is coming. He will find you. He will find you all. And with that, she melted into the darkness, her form swallowed by the night, her presence fading like a ghost into the trees. The forest seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting, as if knowing that something terrible had been set loose upon the world, something that could not be stopped. The moon hung high in the sky, casting its pale light over the cursed woods, over the stones that had held a monster for so long. And in the distance, a howl rose once more, a sound that cut through the silence, a promise of death and destruction. The night was alive with shadows, and the darkness whispered of things that should never have been released, of an ancient evil reborn, a terror that would soon walk the world once more. And somewhere, deep within the shadows, the werewolf moved, its eyes burning with rage, with hunger, with the promise of vengeance yet to come. The beast in the night. The moon hung low in the sky, full and swollen, casting a pale, sickly light over the dense, silent forest. The trees swayed like dark, ancient sentinels as a cold wind swept through them, carrying the scent of damp earth, decay, and something far more sinister, a hint of blood, sharp and metallic. The shadows moved, shifting and alive, as if the forest itself were breathing, waiting, watching. And then it came, a hulking figure, moving through the trees with a feral grace, its massive form barely visible in the darkness. The werewolf. It was a creature born of nightmares, its fur black as midnight, its eyes burning like embers in the gloom. Muscles rippled beneath its skin, each step deliberate, each movement filled with purpose. It was driven by a rage that had festered for centuries, a wrath that had grown deeper and darker with every moment of its imprisonment. Now it was free to unleash its fury upon the world once more. The werewolf moved silently, its nostrils flaring as it caught a scent on the wind, something new, something human. It paused, its ears twitching, its eyes narrowing. Ahead, just beyond the trees, lights flickered. The distant glow of an isolated town, nestled in a valley at the forest's edge. The werewolf's lips curled back in a snarl, a low growl rumbling deep in its throat. It stepped out from the cover of the trees, its massive paws sinking into the wet earth, leaving deep, clawed imprints behind. The beast had only one thought: destruction. This town, this pathetic cluster of human lives, would be the first to feel its vengeance. As it approached, the faint sound of an engine rumbled in the distance, a patrol car slowly making its way down the narrow road that wound through the woods. The werewolf's head snapped in the direction of the sound, its eyes narrowing, its ears twitching. The car drew closer, its headlights cutting through the darkness, revealing the beast for a brief, terrible moment. Inside the patrol car, Officer Jackson leaned back in his seat, one hand lazily resting on the steering wheel, the other holding a cup of lukewarm coffee. His partner, Officer Harris, sat beside him, half asleep, barely paying attention to the dark stretch of road ahead. "Nothing ever happens out here," Jackson muttered, taking a sip of his coffee, his eyes scanning the trees. "Why do we even bother with these late-night patrols?" Harris yawned, shrugging. "Gotta keep the peace, I guess. Not much else to do in this dead-end town." But then, something caught Jackson's eye. A flicker of movement in the distance, something large and dark crossing the road. He squinted, leaning forward, and felt a chill run down his spine. "Hey, did you see that?" he asked, his voice suddenly tense. Harris sat up, rubbing his eyes. "See what?" "They're in the trees," Jackson said, pointing. "Something's out there." Before Harris could respond, the patrol car's headlights illuminated the shape on the side of the road. A massive, black-furred figure, standing on two legs, its eyes glowing like hot coals. The werewolf stared at them, unblinking, its lips curling back to reveal sharp, glistening fangs. "What the hell?" Harris gasped, his voice filled with disbelief. Jackson's hand moved to his radio, but before he could speak, the werewolf moved. It leapt forward with impossible speed, crashing into the front of the patrol car with a force that shattered the windshield and crumpled the hood like paper. The vehicle lurched sideways, skidding off the road and slamming into a tree with a sickening crunch. Jackson and Harris were thrown forward, their bodies jerking violently against their seatbelts. The car's horn blared, a harsh, continuous wail, as smoke began to billow from the engine. Jackson groaned, blood trickling down his forehead, his vision blurred. What is that thing?" The werewolf growled low, a sound that rumbled deep within its chest, vibrating through the air. It reached in through the shattered windshield, its massive claws wrapping around Harris's throat. Harris let out a choked scream as the beast yanked him from the car, its claws digging deep into his flesh. "No, no!" Jackson shouted, fumbling for his gun, his hands shaking. He managed to draw it and fire, but the bullets seemed to do nothing, pinging harmlessly off the werewolf's thick hide. The creature didn't even flinch. It tightened its grip on Harris, lifting him into the air effortlessly. Harris's eyes widened with terror as he stared into the werewolf's glowing eyes, its snarling more, inches from his face. "Please, please," he begged, his voice a strangled whisper. The werewolf didn't hesitate. It snapped its jaws closed, biting down on Harris's neck with a sickening crunch. Blood sprayed into the night, a crimson mist that hung in the cold air. The beast tossed Harris's limp body aside, his neck broken, his eyes staring sightlessly at the moon above. Jackson's heart pounded in his chest. He knew he was next. He tried to crawl out of the car, his legs numb, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Please, don't," he whimpered, his voice filled with desperation. The werewolf turned its gaze to him, a low growl rumbling in its throat, a sound that sent a shiver down his spine. It moved slowly, deliberately, savoring the moment, its claws scraping against the asphalt. Jackson knew there was no escape. He could feel the cold hand of death closing in around him, could feel the primal fear that gripped his soul. He raised his gun again, his hand shaking so badly that he could barely aim. The werewolf lunged. Jackson fired, but the shot went wide. The beast's massive paw struck him across the chest, ripping through his uniform, tearing flesh from bone. Jackson's scream was cut short as the werewolf's jaws clamped down on his shoulder, its fangs sinking deep. The beast shook him like a rag doll, blood pouring from his wounds, bones snapping like twigs. It tossed him aside, his body crumpling to the ground, lifeless, another victim claimed by its fury. The werewolf stood over the broken bodies, its breath steaming in the cold night air, its fur matted with blood. It let out a roar that seemed to shake the very trees, a sound of pure, unbridled rage and triumph. The beast turned its gaze towards the distant lights of the town, a low growl rumbling deep in its throat. There was more blood to be spilled, more vengeance to be unleashed. The centuries of imprisonment had fed its fury, and now that fury would not be contained. With a final snarling grin, the werewolf bounded forward, moving with unnatural speed, its eyes locked on the isolated town that lay vulnerable before it. Tonight, evil would reign, and nothing could stop it. The town of Grey Ridge lay nestled in a shallow valley, its few streets and small cluster of homes bathed in the soft, muted glow of streetlights. It was a place forgotten by time, where life moved at a leisurely pace, and the darkness of the forest beyond was just another part of the landscape. The residents had long grown accustomed to the isolation, finding comfort in the quiet, the predictability of their lives. Tonight, most of the town was asleep, the lights in their homes dim or extinguished, the streets empty save for the occasional patrol car that made its rounds. It was just another peaceful night in Grey Ridge, a town untouched by the chaos of the outside world. But the peace was about to be shattered. The werewolf stood at the edge of the town, its eyes glowing with a malevolent fire as it surveyed the rows of houses before it. The beast's chest heaved with each breath, its mind consumed by centuries of rage, of hatred that had festered and grown in the darkness of its prison. Now free at last, it would have its revenge, not just on the witch who had bound it, but on all those who lived in this world that had forgotten the old ways, forgotten the fear that once gripped humanity. Could this small, sleepy town satisfy the fury that burned within the werewolf? The beast snarled, its lips curling back to reveal rows of gleaming, razor-sharp teeth. This town, with its quiet streets and sleeping residents, would be the first to feel the full force of its wrath. The werewolf threw back its head and howled, a sound so deep, so powerful, that it seemed to reverberate through the very earth. The howl echoed through the valley, a harbinger of the destruction that was about to be unleashed. The beast leapt forward, its massive form moving with terrifying speed, its claws digging into the earth as it bounded toward the nearest house. It was an old, creaking structure, its paint peeling, its windows dark. Inside, a family of 4 slept soundly, unaware of the terror that was about to descend upon them. The werewolf crashed through the front door with a force that splintered the wood and shattered the frame. The noise jolted the family awake, their hearts pounding as they struggled to make sense of the chaos. Before they could even move, the werewolf was upon them, a blur of fur and fangs. The father, bleary-eyed and confused, stumbled out of bed, only to be met with the sight of the beast towering over him, its eyes burning with hatred. He had no time to react before the werewolf lunged, its jaws snapping shut around his throat, silencing his scream in an instant. The mother's scream rang out, piercing the night as she clutched her children to her chest, but the werewolf showed no mercy. It tore through the family with savage brutality, its claws slashing, its fangs ripping through flesh and bone. The house was filled with the sounds of destruction, the crash of furniture, the shattering of glass, the wet, sickening sounds of blood and death. Outside, the town began to stir. Lights flickered on in neighbouring houses as the screams and the noise reached the ears of the sleeping residents. Doors creaked open, and bleary-eyed townsfolk peered into the darkness, trying to understand what was happening. But the werewolf was already moving on, its bloodlust not yet sated. It burst from the ruined house, its fur matted with blood, its eyes burning with an unholy fire. The beast leapt toward the next house, crashing through a window, sending shards of glass flying. The occupants inside barely had time to register the threat before the werewolf was upon them, tearing through them with a fury born of centuries of confinement. Screams filled the night, mingling with the sounds of destruction. The town came to life in a frenzy of fear and confusion. People stumbled from their homes, some clutching makeshift weapons, kitchen knives, baseball bats, while others simply ran, their minds gripped by a terror they could not comprehend. A few tried to fight back, their faces pale with fear, but determined to protect their loved ones. They swung their weapons wildly as the werewolf approached, but their efforts were futile. The beast was unstoppable, a force of nature, a vessel of pure, unrelenting evil. It tore through them with ease, its claws rending flesh, its jaws snapping bones with terrifying precision. The streets of Grey Ridge were soon painted red, the bodies of the fallen littering the ground, their blood seeping into the cracks of the pavement. The werewolf moved from house to house, leaving nothing but death and destruction in its wake. It revelled in the chaos, the fear, the screams that filled the air like a symphony of despair. The town was dying. The realization spread through the few remaining survivors like a cold, paralyzing wave. There was no hope, no escape from the terror that stalked their streets. The werewolf was relentless, driven by a hatred so deep that nothing could stand in its way. It was a force of destruction, a nightmare made flesh. As the night wore on, the town of Greyridge was reduced to a smouldering ruin. Houses stood in tatters, their windows shattered, their doors torn from their hinges. The streets were strewn with debris, the bodies of the dead lying in twisted, broken heaps. The once quiet town was now a scene of pure destruction, a testament to the werewolf's fury. The beast stood in the centre of the town, its chest heaving with exertion, its eyes still burning with that same unquenchable fire. It howled again, a sound that carried far into the night, a declaration of victory, of vengeance served. The werewolf had claimed its first victims, but it was not yet done. Its hunger was far from satisfied. The beast turned its gaze towards the horizon, where the dark forest met the edge of the world. Somewhere out there, more lives awaited, more blood to be spilled, more terror to be unleashed. The werewolf licked the blood from its jaws, its eyes narrowing with anticipation. With a final, snarling grin, it bounded away from the ruins of Greyridge, disappearing into the night, leaving behind a town that would never wake again, its name destined to be whispered in fear, a warning of the darkness that still roamed the earth. A call for help. The morning sun crept over the horizon, its light casting long shadows over what was left of Greyridge. The town was a smouldering ruin, a graveyard of twisted metal, shattered wood, and lifeless bodies strewn across the streets. Smoke rose in thin, black tendrils from the remnants of houses that had been burned to their foundations. The air was thick with the acrid smell of blood, smoke, and despair. Police cars and ambulances lined the main road, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow on the destruction. Officers moved through the wreckage, their faces pale and stunned, trying to make sense of the horror that had unfolded. The quiet chatter of radios filled the air, their static-laden voices punctuated by the occasional gasp or muttered curse. Sheriff Tom Harper, a veteran lawman with salt and pepper hair, and a face lined by years of hard living, stood at the centre of it all, his expression grim. He stared at the remains of the town, his eyes scanning the scene, trying to piece together what could have done this. It looked like a bomb had gone off, but there were no signs of fire or explosion, only claw marks, deep gouges in the earth, and a blood trail leading to the edge of the woods. "Never seen anything like this," muttered a young deputy standing beside him, his voice shaky. "Not in all my years." Sheriff Harper sighed, rubbing his temples. "Ain't natural, that's for sure, but I'll be damned if I know what we're dealing with here." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "But there's someone who might." The deputy frowned, confused. "Who, Sheriff?" Harper turned, looking over the devastated town, and spoke softly, as if summoning a name from a forgotten legend. "Jonas Creed," he said. "An old hunter. They say he's taken down things most folks would never believe, creatures that make this mess look like a picnic." The deputy blinked. "Jonas Creed? I thought he was just a story. A ghost tale people told to scare their kids." The sheriff chuckled, a grim smile on his face. "Oh, he's real all right. And he's as mean and tough as they come. But we haven't called on him in years. Folks like to think they don't need a man like Creed anymore. Thought we could solve all our problems with computers and fancy gadgets. Maybe we've gotten too soft for what's out there in the dark." He turned to another officer. "Send a car out to Creed's place. Tell him we need his help." The officer nodded, though he looked unsure. "You really think he'll come, Sheriff? Last I heard, he's been living out there on that old farm, drinking himself to death." Sheriff Harper shrugged. "If anyone can deal with this, it's him. And if he won't come, then God help us all." The car bounced and rattled along the dirt road, a plume of dust trailing behind it as it wound its way through the dense woods. The driver, a young officer named Mike, gripped the wheel tightly, his eyes focused on the narrow, winding path. He had heard stories about Jonas Creed his whole life, stories of a man who had hunted things that should not exist, things that haunted the darkest corners of the earth, but he had never expected to meet him. He pulled up to an old, broken-down farmhouse at the end of the road. The place looked abandoned, its windows boarded up, the paint peeling and faded, the roof sagging in places. A rusted pickup truck sat in the overgrown yard, its tires flat, and its body coated with a thick layer of dirt. Mike hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the wind rustled through the tall grass. He approached the porch, the wood creaking under his boots, and raised his hand to knock on the door. Before he could touch the wood, the door swung open, and the cold barrel of a shotgun was thrust into his face. Mike froze, his heart hammering in his chest. "Who the hell are you, and what do you want here?" growled a deep, gravelly voice from behind the gun. Mike swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He looked past the barrel and saw a man standing in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered and scarred from years of hard living. His hair was silver, his beard thick and untamed. His eyes were like ice, cold, calculating, and hard as steel. This was Jonas Creed. "Sheriff Harper sent me," Mike stammered. He said we need your help, sir. Something terrible happened in town last night. Something we can't explain." Creed didn't lower the gun, his eyes narrowing. "Thought you folks had given up on men like me," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Thought you could handle everything from behind your fancy desks, sipping your spiced lattes and playing with your gadgets." Mike tried to keep his voice steady. "Sir, please, the town's gone. Everyone's dead. We don't know what did it, but it was something bad." Creed's lips curled into a grim smile, a humorless laugh escaping his throat. "Something bad, huh? Well, you ain't wrong about that." He paused, considering for a moment, then sighed. "But I'm too old for this. Get someone younger, someone who still believes in your shiny new world. I've done my time." Mike's desperation showed on his face. "Please, Mr. Creed. The sheriff says you're the only one who can help us. We need you. The town needs you." Creed studied the young officer for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he lowered the shotgun, a weary sigh escaping his lips. "All right," he muttered. "I'll take a look, but don't expect any miracles." Mike nodded, relieved. "Thank you, sir. Thank you. We'll get you whatever you need." Creed turned, heading back inside, his voice carrying over his shoulder. "What I need is for you to stay out of my way. Now go back to your car and tell Harper I'll be there when I'm ready." He disappeared into the darkness of the farmhouse, leaving Mike standing alone on the porch, his heart still racing. As he turned to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were waking something old, something dangerous, and whatever it was, they would need all the help they could get. Jonas Creed stood in the dim light of his farmhouse, a silhouette against the cracked and weathered walls. He was a man carved from stone, his face a rugged map of scars and lines that told the story of a lifetime spent facing darkness. His eyes, cold and grey, held a hardness that came from seeing things no man should ever see, things that had left their mark not only on his skin, but on his very soul. His hair, once jet black, was now streaked with silver, and his beard, thick and unruly, framed a mouth set in a grim line. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if weighed down by the memories of battles fought and demons slain. His hands, large and calloused, bore the signs of countless encounters with creatures that most would consider mere legends. Each finger was marked by small, pale scars, the skin thickened by years of gripping knives, guns and other weapons meant to kill the things that lurked in the dark. Creed walked over to an old wooden cabinet, its doors creaking as he pulled them open. Inside, a collection of weapons gleamed faintly in the half-light. He reached in, his fingers brushing over the familiar shapes. Shotguns, revolvers, crossbows, silver-tipped arrows, knives with blessed steel blades, and an assortment of vials filled with strange liquids. His arsenal was a testament to the years he'd spent hunting things that defied reason and science, things that had no place in a sane world. He pulled out a large duffel bag from the bottom of the cabinet and began methodically loading it with weapons. A sawed-off shotgun, a silver-inlaid revolver, a combat knife with a jagged edge. Each piece felt heavy in his hand, each piece a reminder of what he once was, a man who had stood against evil and survived, again and again, until the weight of it all had become too much to bear. Creed's gaze drifted over to the far corner of the room, where an old tarp covered something large and bulky. He strode over and yanked the cover off, revealing a car that had not seen daylight in many years. It was a classic, a 1970 Dodge Charger, its paint a faded black, the chrome dulled with age. The car had been heavily modified over the years. The windows were reinforced, the tyres thick and rugged, the engine tuned for power and speed. A few custom panels hid compartments where weapons could be stored, and a heavy steel grille covered the front, designed to withstand impact. He ran a hand over the hood, a small smile touching his lips for the first time in years. "Oh, Betsy," he muttered. "Haven't taken you out in a long time." He opened the driver's door with a creak and slid into the seat, the leather worn but familiar. For a moment, he just sat there, gripping the wheel, his fingers tapping against it in a slow, rhythmic pattern. He looked out through the cracked windshield at the overgrown yard, the trees swaying in the breeze. "What are you doing, you old fool?" he muttered to himself, his voice low and rough. "You're past it. Got nothing left to give. You should have stayed in the bottle. Let the world sort itself out." But even as he spoke, he could feel a familiar pull, a calling he thought he had left behind. His gaze drifted to the rearview mirror, where his own eyes stared back at him, hollow and tired. "Maybe I need some help," he said, a grim smile crossing his lips. "Eldritch, you old bastard. You still out there? Sure could use some of your help right now if things are as bad as they say." Eldritch, a name he hadn't spoken in years. A vampire, old as time, with a face like a forgotten painting, faded and cracked. A creature who had somehow found a strange friendship with Creed over years of bloodshed and mutual respect. They had fought side by side once, against horrors that had crawled out of the shadows, and Creed knew that if anyone still walked that thin line between light and darkness, it was Eldritch. He sighed. "I'll take a look first," he muttered, turning the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then roared to life, its deep growl filling the stillness of the farmhouse. The old car shook slightly, its tyres settling into the earth. Creed looked into the rearview mirror again, staring at his own reflection, the grey in his beard, the lines etched into his face, the eyes that had seen too much. "Old, weak, washed-up Jonas," he said softly, his tone mocking. "What are you going to do to evil, huh? Roll up in a wheelchair and hope it takes pity on you?" He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head, but even as he mocked himself, he could feel something stirring within him, an old fire that had never truly gone out. He knew he was not the man he once was. He knew his best days were behind him, but he also knew there was a reason they had come to him, and not to some young hotshot with a shiny badge. "Maybe there's a little fight left in you, old man," he muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. "Maybe just enough." He reached over, grabbing the duffel bag from the passenger seat and unzipping it just enough to see the glint of metal inside. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the years pressing down on him, but also had the familiar thrill of the hunt, the taste of danger on his tongue. He shoved the car into gear, the tyres spinning briefly in the dirt before finding traction. The Charger lurched forward, out of the shadows of the farmhouse and onto the road, its engine growling like a caged beast, eager to be unleashed. "All right, you son of a bitch," Creed muttered under his breath, staring down the road toward the ruined town. "Let's see what you've got." The old car roared down the dirt road, kicking up dust as it barreled into the darkness, toward the unknown, toward whatever horror awaited in the wake of the werewolf's wrath. Jonas Creed had been at the town of Grey Ridge for hours, moving methodically through the ruins like a ghost, his eyes scanning the carnage with a practiced, unflinching gaze. The air was thick with the scent of smoke, blood and fear, a tangible, oppressive thing that hung over the town like a shroud. Bodies lay strewn across the streets, their faces twisted in terror, their wounds deep and vicious. The destruction was absolute. No house left untouched, no street spared the wrath of whatever had torn through this place in the dead of night. Creed crouched beside a mangled body, his fingers lightly tracing the claw marks that cut through flesh and bone. His face was grim, eyes narrowed, taking in every detail. He could see the depth of the gouges, the way the wounds had been inflicted with deliberate, brutal force. He stood slowly, his knees cracking from age, and moved to the side of a ruined car, examining the deep scratches along its side. The glass shattered, the metal bent and twisted. After a while, he walked up to Sheriff Harper, who was standing near the edge of the town square, his face pale and drawn, his hat pulled low over his eyes. Harper turned as Creed approached, his expression a mix of hope and fear. "Well?" Harper asked, his voice heavy with worry. "What are we dealing with here?" Creed spat on the ground, wiping his hands on his worn jeans. "Yep, it's a lichen all right," he said, his voice a low growl. "A big one. Something different about this one. Never seen a lichen take down a whole town before. This is strange, though. Feels different. Feels wrong." Mike, the young deputy, frowned and stepped forward, looking confused. "What's a lichen?" he asked, his voice tinged with nervous laughter, as if he hoped it was some kind of joke. Creed turned to him, his expression dead serious. "It's a big, hairy, smelly dog, but with a mean streak a mile long," he replied. "Some folks call them werewolves." Mike chuckled, thinking Creed was trying to lighten the mood, but the laughter died in his throat when he saw the look on Jonas's face. Creed wasn't joking, he was deadly serious. "A werewolf," Mike stammered, disbelief in his eyes. "Like from the movies?" Creed shrugged. "More or less. Only this one ain't like the stories you hear. It's big, it's bad, and it's got a taste for blood. And from what I can see here, it's a lot meaner than the usual kind." Sheriff Harper rubbed his temples, trying to wrap his mind around what Creed was saying. "What do we do then, Jonas? How do we stop it?" Creed smirked, his eyes never leaving the claw marks on a nearby wall. "I'm gonna track it," he said simply. "Been doing this a long time. Don't need you or your boys getting in my way. If I need help, I'll yell, but don't send your men after it. This one's different. Strange. Evil somehow." Harper frowned, trying to find the right words. "We can offer backup, support. Hell, we can call in the National Guard if we have to." Creed snorted, spitting again on the ground. "If I need a soy latte, I'll call you," he snapped. "Just stay out of my way, Sheriff. This is my fight." The sheriff sighed, knowing better than to argue. "All right, Jonas," he muttered. "But if you need anything..." Creed didn't wait to hear the rest. He turned and started walking, his eyes scanning the ground, looking for signs, for tracks. His movements were precise, deliberate. He was in his element now, hunting. He moved past the shattered windows and broken doors, his boots crunching on glass and debris, his hand resting on the hilt of a silver knife hanging from his belt. The tracks were fresh, clear, deep paw prints in the soft earth. The claws, long and sharp. The beast had moved fast, but not without purpose. It was heading towards the forest, toward deeper shadows. Creed felt a familiar thrill, the rush of the hunt, building in his veins, the fire in his belly awakening after so many years. He followed the tracks out of the town, moving with the silent confidence of a predator, his senses sharp, alert. The woods loomed before him, dark and foreboding, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. He paused at the edge of the forest, glancing back at the ruined town, the bodies, the devastation. "What are you up to, you old fool?" he muttered to himself, his voice low. "Chasing shadows in the dark, thinking you still got what it takes." But there was no turning back now. He knew that much. Something had come back into the world, something that should have stayed buried, and he was the only one who knew how to deal with it. He took a deep breath, tightened his grip on the knife, and stepped into the woods. The darkness swallowed him whole, the trees closing in around him, the shadows deepening. He moved with a purpose, following the scent, the tracks, the signs. He was on the trail now, and nothing was going to stop him. His eyes scanned the path ahead, every sense alert. The wind whispered through the leaves, carrying with it the faintest hint of something rotten, something foul. He knew the beast was out there, waiting, hunting, just like him. "All right, you big ugly son of a bitch," he muttered under his breath, a grim smile spreading across his face. "Let's see what you've got." And with that, Jonas Creed plunged deeper into the darkness, in pursuit of the beast, the scent of death heavy in the air, the thrill of the hunt pounding in his veins. Jonas Creed tracked the creature for hours, moving through the dense, dark woods with a determination that defied his age. He felt the old aches in his bones, the stiffness in his joints, but he pushed through it, driven by the thrill of the hunt and the knowledge that he was the only one who stood between the beast and the lives it would claim next. The trees began to thin, and the ground beneath his boots turned from dirt to gravel. He emerged from the woods, standing at the entrance to another town, this one larger than Grey Ridge. The main street stretched out before him, its shops and homes lined with old-fashioned streetlights that flickered in the gathering dusk. Jonas could already hear the screams echoing through the air, mingling with the sharp wails of sirens. He smelled smoke, saw the faint glow of fires spreading. The beast was already here, tearing through the town like a storm. Panic spread like wildfire as people ran, their faces twisted in terror, doors slamming, windows shattering. Creed smiled grimly, wiping sweat from his brow. "I got one more in me," he muttered to himself, gripping his shotgun tighter. He took off running towards the chaos. Ahead, he saw the creature in its full, monstrous form. It moved with terrifying speed, smashing through walls, dragging people from their homes, its eyes glowing with an unnatural, malevolent light. The werewolf was larger than any he'd ever seen. Its muscles rippled under its thick, matted fur, its claws sharp and deadly. Blood stained its jaws, its breath coming in deep, ragged growls. Jonas heard a crash above him, and he looked up just in time to see the beast burst from the top floor of a 3-story building. The werewolf leaped from a shattered window, glass and debris flying in all directions. It landed with a thunderous impact in the middle of the street, directly in front of him. Dust and rubble swirled in the air, and the beast rose to its full height, its eyes locking onto Jonas. Jonas stopped, a grin spreading across his face despite the gravity of the moment. "Well, looky here," he said, his voice calm. almost amused. "You are a big boy." The werewolf snarled, its lips pulling back to reveal rows of razor-sharp teeth, each one dripping with saliva and blood. It crouched low, ready to spring. Jonas didn't hesitate. He reached under his coat and pulled out his sawed-off shotgun, a weapon he had customized over years of hunting. The barrels gleamed in the dim light, loaded with a mix of silver pellets, blessed herbs, and powdered wolfsbane. He aimed directly at the beast's chest, his hand steady, his breath slow and measured. "Let's see how you like this," he muttered and pulled the trigger. The shotgun roared, a deafening boom that echoed down the street. The blast struck the werewolf dead on, slamming into its chest with a force that pushed it back several feet. The beast staggered, growling in pain, but it was hardly fazed. Its eyes burned brighter, filled with rage, and it shook its massive head, dislodging the smoking herbs and silver fragments embedded in its fur. Jonas chuckled. "You tough son of a gun," he said, flipping the gun open and loading another shell. "All right then, one-on-one, the old-fashioned way." The werewolf snarled, and then it lunged. It moved with incredible speed, closing the distance between them in the blink of an eye. Jonas fired again, but the beast swiped the gun aside with a powerful clawed hand, sending it skittering across the pavement. The creature's other hand lashed out, catching Jonas across the chest. Claws ripped through his shirt, cutting deep, drawing blood. Jonas grunted in pain, but didn't falter. He reached for the silver knife at his belt and slashed at the beast's arm, drawing a line of dark, oozing blood. The werewolf howled, pulling back, its eyes blazing with fury. "Come on!" Jonas shouted, his voice fierce. "Let's dance!" The beast lunged again, its jaws snapping inches from Jonas's face. He ducked, rolling to the side, and jabbed the knife upward, catching the werewolf in the side. The creature roared, spinning around, its claws swiping at him. Jonas ducked and dodged, moving with surprising agility for a man his age, but he could feel his strength waning, his breaths coming in shorter, sharper gasps. The werewolf came at him again, and this time it was faster, more ferocious. It slammed into Jonas with the force of a freight train, knocking him off his feet. He hit the ground hard, his head smacking against the pavement. Stars exploded in his vision, and for a moment he felt the world spinning. He tried to get up, but the werewolf was on him. It grabbed him by the leg, dragging him across the street, its claws digging into his flesh. Jonas slashed at its arm again with the knife, but the beast was too strong, too fast. It flung him into a nearby wall, and he hit with a bone-jarring thud, feeling something crack in his ribs. Pain shot through his body, but he forced himself to stand. Coughing up blood. "That all you got?" he spat, blood dripping from his mouth. "I've had worse from my ex-wife." The werewolf roared in rage and came at him again, this time with all its strength. It swiped its massive claws across his chest, cutting deep, and Jonas felt the searing pain as he was thrown back against the ground, his body broken and bleeding. He struggled to move, his vision blurring, his strength fading. The beast loomed over him, its hot breath washing over his face, its eyes filled with a savage triumph. It raised its clawed hand, ready to deliver the final blow. Jonas, gasping for breath, managed a weak smile. "Don't worry, big boy," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't expect to win this one." The werewolf hesitated, as if sensing something in his tone, but then its claws came down, tearing into Jonas's chest. He felt a white, hot pain, his body convulsing, his vision going dark. With his last breath, he spoke again, his voice a ragged whisper. "But I caught someone. Who does?" The werewolf paused, tilting its head, confused, but before it could react, Jonas's body went limp, his eyes staring blankly up at the darkening sky. He was gone. The beast stood over him, panting, its breath steaming in the cool night air. It let out a triumphant howl, the sound echoing through the ruined town. but there was a flicker of uncertainty in its eyes, a momentary hesitation. It sensed something, someone out there, watching, waiting, and the hunt was far from over. Hours before his final encounter with the werewolf, Jonas Creed made his way to the old stone circle. The woods were thick with mist, the air cold and heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The ancient stones stood in the clearing like silent sentinels, covered in moss and etched with runes that seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly light. Jonas sat down on one of the stones, his breath misting in the cool night air. He pulled a flask from his coat pocket, taking a deep swig, and waited. He knew he wasn't alone. "Come on, Eldritch," he muttered to the darkness. "I know you're out there, lurking like the creep you are." A moment later, a shadow began to take shape in the mist, a figure emerging from the darkness. Eldritch, the ancient vampire, stepped forward. He was tall and gaunt, his skin pale as moonlight, his eyes dark as coal. He wore a long, tattered coat that seemed to ripple around him like shadows themselves. Eldritch's voice was smooth, almost musical, with a hint of something otherworldly. "Jonas," he said, nodding in acknowledgement. "I heard your call. What madness brings you here to these stones on such a night?" Jonas smirked, tipping his hat. "I need your help, old friend. That thing out there, it's worse than anything I've faced before. It's not just a werewolf. It's something darker, something stronger." Eldritch sighed, his eyes narrowing with concern. "A lichen of this strength. My powers are useless against it. You know that, Jonas. I can't fight it for you." Jonas nodded, rubbing his grizzled chin. "I figured as much. But you've got other tricks up your sleeve, and I've got an idea that might just work. Something about how the damn thing got trapped in the first place. Tell me about the witch." Eldridge's expression darkened, and he stepped closer, his movements smooth and effortless, like a shadow gliding across the ground. "The witch, Isolde Blackthorn," he began, his voice low, almost reverent. "She was powerful, more powerful than any mortal should have been. She saw the destruction this beast could cause, the havoc it could wreak, and she made it her mission to imprison it. She used an ancient ritual, drawing power from the stones, from the moon, from the very earth itself. But she paid a price that bound her to this place, even in death." Jonas's eyes narrowed. "Can we bring her back?" Eldritch hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Summoning the dead is dangerous, even for me. Her spirit is tied to this circle, but to bring her back fully, to give her the strength she had in life, it would require a great deal of power, and the ritual would need to be performed with absolute precision." Jonas chuckled, a weary grin on his face. "Hell, I'm not here for my health, Eldritch. I'm here because I've got nothing left to lose. You do the fancy magic stuff, and I'll do what I do best. Kick a little ass and slow this thing down." Eldritch looked at him, a flicker of sadness in his ancient eyes. "Jonas, you know what this will cost you. You're already dying. The cancer, it's eaten you alive. You shouldn't even be here." Jonas shrugged, taking another swig from his flask. "I wasn't planning on going out in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines, pissing myself. Figured I'd rather go out with a bang, and maybe help save some folks in the process. So what do you say, old man? Can you do it?" Eldritch nodded slowly, a hint of respect in his gaze. "Very well, Jonas. I will help you, but know this. Once we start, there is no turning back." Jonas grinned, tossing the empty flask aside. "Never was one for turning back. Let's get to it." Eldritch stepped towards the stones, his hands raised, and began to chant in a language that was ancient, forgotten, a language that seemed to hum and vibrate in the air around them. The runes on the stones began to glow brighter, a soft, ethereal light that spread across the clearing. Jonas watched, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife, ready for whatever came next. Eldridge's voice grew louder, the words coming faster, more intense. The air seemed to grow colder, and a wind picked up, swirling through the trees, rustling the leaves. The light from the stones flared, and a mist began to rise from the ground, thickening, coalescing into a shape. A figure began to form in the mist, shadowy and faded at first, barely visible. Slowly it took shape, a woman, tall and thin, with long flowing hair, and eyes that seemed to burn with a fierce, unnatural light. Her form flickered and wavered, as if caught between worlds. But gradually, she began to solidify, her presence growing stronger. Jonas could feel the power emanating from her, a cold, raw energy that sent a shiver down his spine. "Isolde Blackthorn," he muttered, a hint of awe in his voice. "Damn!" The witch's eyes opened, her gaze fierce and commanding. She looked around, taking in her surroundings, and then her eyes settled on Eldritch and Jonas. Her voice was low and echoing, filled with ancient authority. "Who has called me from the shadows?" Eldritch stepped forward, bowing slightly. "I have, Lady Blackthorn," he said. "We need your help. The beast you once trapped is free again, and its evil grows stronger by the moment. We cannot defeat it alone." The witch's eyes narrowed, her form still flickering slightly. "I remember the beast," she said slowly, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "And I remember the price I paid to trap it. Why should I help you now?" Jonas stepped forward, his hand resting on his knife. "Because if you don't, it'll tear this world apart," he said simply. "And because I'm willing to give whatever's left of me to buy you the time you need to stop it." Isolde studied him for a moment, her eyes piercing, as if looking into his very soul. Then she nodded slowly. "Very well, mortal. I will do what I can, but know that the cost will be high." Jonas grinned. "Figured as much. I'm going to go on ahead, slow the thing down. You do your thing here. Eldridge, take care of her." Eldridge and Jonas exchanged a long, knowing look. For all their differences, they shared a bond forged in blood and darkness. They both knew this would be the last time they saw each other. Eldridge's face softened, a hint of sorrow in his ancient eyes. "Jonas, you've been a fool all your life, but a brave one. I'll see you on the other side." Jonas laughed, though it was tinged with sadness. "Take a drink of ale for me, you skinny bastard," he said, clapping Eldridge on the shoulder. "I'm counting on you." Eldridge nodded, his expression serious. "Go then. Do what you must." Jonas turned and walked away, his steps slow but steady. He knew this was the end, but it was the ending he'd chosen, the one he'd wanted. He would go out fighting, just like he'd always lived. Behind him, Eldridge continued his chant, and the witch's form grew stronger, more solid, her power filling the air around them. Her eyes glowed with a fierce, fiery light, and she raised her hands, drawing energy from the stones, from the earth itself. She was ready to face the evil that had once eluded her, ready to try again and stop this monstrous lichen. Jonas disappeared into the darkness, his figure growing smaller, his steps resolute. The witch's power grew, and she became a solid entity once more, a force to be reckoned with, ready to battle the evil that had been unleashed upon the world. The hunt was far from over. hunt. In the storm. The night was thick with rain, the sky a swirling cauldron of black clouds. Thunder rumbled overhead, and jagged bolts of lightning cut through the darkness, briefly illuminating the dense, tangled forest below. The rain came down in torrents, drumming against the leaves, turning the ground to mud, and filling the air with a steady roar. The world seemed to close in, becoming small and claustrophobic, as if the storm itself had trapped them in this living nightmare. Sheriff Tom Harper gripped the steering wheel of his patrol truck, his knuckles white with tension. His windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the relentless downpour. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, his eyes fixed on the shadows beyond the rain-streaked glass. In the back seat, Mike, the young deputy, sat rigid, his eyes wide and fearful. Behind them, 2 other police vehicles followed, their lights flashing through the sheets of rain, the beams of their headlights barely piercing the darkness. "We've got to find it," Harper growled, his voice filled with a mix of anger and fear. "That thing killed Jonas Creed. It tore him apart like he was nothing. We can't let it get away." The radio crackled to life. "Sheriff, we're not sure what we're dealing with here," came the shaky voice of Deputy Harris from one of the trailing cars. "Are you sure? Are we sure it's a werewolf?" Sheriff Harper took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing. "What else could it be?" he snapped. "You saw what it did to the town, what it did to Creed. It's out there, and we're going to put it down before it tears this place apart." He glanced at Mike, who was clutching his shotgun so tightly his hands were trembling. "Stay sharp, kid," Harper said, trying to sound confident. "It's just a big animal. We'll find it, and we'll take it down." But deep down, Harper knew better. He had seen the aftermath. Jonas's broken body, the look in his eyes just before the end. This was no ordinary animal. It was something darker, something far more dangerous. They reached the edge of the woods, where the dense trees loomed like a wall of shadows. Harper killed the engine, and the men piled out of their vehicles, flashlights cutting through the gloom. The rain was cold, soaking them to the bone within seconds. The thunder boomed above them, and the wind howled through the branches, making the trees sway like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. "Fan out," Harper ordered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Stay close. Keep your radios on. If you see anything at all, call it in. We don't take any chances." The men nodded, their faces grim and tense. They moved into the woods, their boots squelching in the mud, their flashlights sweeping through the underbrush. The trees were thick, the branches low, creating a maze of shadows and shifting shapes. Every step felt like a struggle, the mud pulling at their feet, the rain blinding them. Suddenly, a branch snapped somewhere in the darkness. Everyone froze, flashlights swinging toward the sound. The rain drummed harder, the wind howling through the trees, masking any noise. Harper felt a cold sweat on his forehead, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to steady his breathing, to keep his fear in check. "Did anyone see that?" Harris's voice crackled over the radio, tinged with panic. "No, just keep moving," Harper replied, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Eyes open, stay alert." They pushed deeper into the woods, the shadows growing thicker, the rain louder, the air colder. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves set their nerves on edge. Harper could feel it. A presence, something watching them, stalking them from just beyond the edge of the light. Then another sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The men stopped, their flashlights swinging wildly, trying to pinpoint the source. Harper's heart skipped a beat. "Stay together," he shouted. "Don't split up." But it was too late. The werewolf struck with blinding speed, a blur of fur and fangs leaping from the shadows. It crashed into the nearest officer, dragging him screaming into the darkness. The others barely had time to react before the night was filled with the sounds of tearing flesh and desperate, choked cries for help. "Jesus Christ," Mike yelled, his voice breaking with fear. He fired his shotgun blindly into the darkness, the flash of the muzzle lighting up the rain for a brief moment. But the werewolf was already gone, vanished back into the woods. "We've got to get out of here," another officer shouted, his eyes wide with terror. "It's hunting us." "No," Harper barked. "We hold our ground. It wants us to panic. Stay together, damn it." But panic was already setting in. One by one, the men began to scatter, their flashlights bobbing through the trees, their voices rising in frantic fear. The werewolf moved like a shadow, darting from one target to the next, taking them down with savage efficiency. Another officer screamed, his body pulled into the darkness, his flashlight falling to the ground, the beam pointing upward as the rain poured down. Harper's breath came in short, ragged gasps. He could feel the terror clawing at his throat, his hands trembling despite his best efforts to stay calm. Damn it all," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. He turned to Mike, who was standing frozen, his eyes wide with fear. "Mike, stay close to me," he said, his voice softer now. "We're gonna make it out of this. Just keep your eyes on me." But before Mike could respond, a massive shadow loomed behind him. Harper's eyes widened in horror as he saw the werewolf, its eyes glowing red in the dark, its fangs bared in a feral grin. "Mike! Behind you!" Harper screamed, but it was too late. The werewolf pounced, its claws ripping into Mike's back, tearing through flesh and bone. Mike's scream was cut short as the beast dragged him into the darkness, his flashlight tumbling from his hand, the beam flickering and dying in the mud. Harper fired his rifle, but the shots went wide, lost in the rain and wind. No, damn it," he shouted, feeling the panic rise in his chest. He backed away, his eyes darting left and right, searching for any sign of the creature. The woods seemed to close in around him, the darkness becoming deeper, the rain louder, drowning out everything but the sound of his own heartbeat. He could feel it now, the terror, the realization that he was the last one left, the prey. He tried to steady his breath, to calm his racing heart, but it was no use. The werewolf was out there somewhere, watching, waiting. He heard a faint rustle to his left and spun around, rifle at the ready, but saw nothing. The darkness pressed in closer, the rain like cold needles against his skin. Then a whisper of movement behind him, a soft crunch of leaves. He turned, his rifle raised, but before he could react, the werewolf was upon him, slamming him to the ground with a force that knocked the wind from his lungs. Harper felt the cold, wet ground against his back, the rain washing over his face. He looked up, and there it was, the werewolf, towering over him, its eyes burning with a malevolent light, its fangs dripping with rain and blood. Harper felt his breath catch in his throat, his fingers tightening around the trigger, but he knew it was too late. He was the last, and he was prey. The beast lunged, and the last thing Harper saw was the flash of lightning illuminating the werewolf's snarling face as it descended upon him, the roar of thunder drowning out his final scream. The storm raged on, but in the woods all was silent. The hunt was over, and the darkness had won. Eldritch stood beside Isolde, watching her hands weave through the air with precise, practiced movements. Each gesture left a trail of faint, glowing symbols hanging in the damp, misty night. The ancient stones around them seemed to hum with a quiet energy, resonating with the spell she was channeling. The air felt thick, charged with a power that made Eldridge's skin tingle. "They will buy us some time," Isolde muttered, her voice low and focused, her eyes never leaving the patterns her hands created. Not much, but hopefully enough to complete this spell. Eldridge's dark eyes followed the glow of her movements. He could feel the tension in the air, the urgency. He stepped closer, his long coat fluttering slightly in the night wind. "So why is this lichen different from the rest?" he asked, his voice smooth but curious. "Why did you trap it instead of just killing it?" Isolde's hands paused for a moment, her gaze hardening as she spoke. "We tried," she replied, her voice filled with a mixture of frustration and fear. "It just wouldn't die. An old warlock called Malakar used the lichen curse and added dark magic. We hunted down and slew many of its pack, but each time we killed one, this one seemed to grow stronger. It was as if it was absorbing the power of the fallen lichens, feeding on their essence. With every one we slew, it grew angrier, more powerful." Eldridge's brows furrowed. "So there was no killing it?" Isolde nodded. "No. In the end, there was no way to destroy it. We could only contain it. Binding it with ancient magic was the only way. Until now." Eldridge allowed a small smile to curl his lips. "Well, with today's weapons, I'd say we could do some serious damage," he remarked, half in jest, half in genuine hope. Isolde's eyes glinted with faint amusement, but her tone remained grim. "That may be," she said, "but that thing isn't just some beast. It's running on pure primal hatred. It's concentrated evil. I don't know if the spell will be strong enough to contain it this time. It has grown in its anger, its fury, its darkness." Eldridge nodded slowly, his expression turning serious. "Yes, being stuck in this little trap of yours for a few hundred years will do that," he replied, casting a glance around the glowing stones. "It's like leaving a predator to starve. Makes them desperate, makes them crazier." Isolde continued to weave her symbols, her eyes filled with determination. "If this doesn't work," she said quietly, "I don't think there is anyone left who can stop it." Eldridge leaned against one of the stones, folding his arms. "Oh, I know someone who might be able to do the job," he said with a sly grin. "Problem is, he's probably out there saving reality itself. Just a little busy at the moment." Isolde looked at him, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Who are you talking about?" Eldridge waved a dismissive hand. "Never mind. Let's focus on the task at hand. You're right. We need to hurry if we're to stand any chance of trapping it again." Isolde nodded, her movements becoming quicker, more frantic. "We'll need to hunt it down," she murmured. "Get it back here, to the stones." Eldridge held up a hand, his face a mask of concern. "Hold on a minute," he said, his voice more serious now. "I'm an elder, and even a regular lichen could tear through me like paper. This big one, it'll rip me in half without breaking a sweat. My powers are useless against it." Isolde glanced over at him, a determined glint in her eyes. "Stay in the shadows," she instructed. "We don't need you to fight it. We need to lure it back to this place, back to the stones where it can be trapped." Eldridge sighed, nodding reluctantly. "Fine, I'll play the bait if I have to, but this better work, Isolde." For a long while, Isolde continued her incantations, the glow of her symbols growing brighter, more intense. The air around them grew colder, the mist thickening. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she stopped and exhaled deeply, her face pale and drawn from the effort. "There," she said, a hint of exhaustion in her voice. "The trap is ready." Eldridge looked at the glowing symbols around the stones, feeling the surge of magic in the air. "Now we just need to find that beast and get it to step into your little snare." Isolde nodded, her expression hardening with determination. "If it doesn't work this time," she whispered, "I fear nothing will." Eldritch gave her a sideways glance. "Let's hope it does," he muttered, "because if it doesn't, we're both going to find out just how many pieces that thing can tear us into." They shared a tense look, knowing that the fate of many hung in the balance. With the trap set, they would need to move quickly, and hope that their efforts would be enough to hold back the tide of darkness that was coming. The rain poured down in thick sheets, drumming against the canopy of leaves overhead and turning the forest floor into a slick, treacherous mess. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low, growling roar that seemed to echo through the dark woods. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the twisted trunks and gnarled branches, casting jagged shadows across the wet earth. The storm was in full force, and the night seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as if the very elements knew the battle that was about to unfold. Isolde turned to Eldritch, her face set with determination. "Lure it here if you can," she instructed, her voice calm despite the tension in the air. "I will confront the beast. Its hatred for me will surely drive it mad, make it reckless. If the beast reaches the circle, you'll see it, and if I lure it, come to my aid as fast as you can. I will come should you be the one to bring it here. There will be much more to do once it is at the stones." Eldritch nodded, a sly smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Good luck, witch." Isolde returned the smile, a rare glint of humour in her eyes. "And you, vampire." With that, they parted ways, each moving in opposite directions through the dark, rain-soaked forest, their footsteps swallowed by the sound of the storm. The woods were dense and foreboding, the rain lashing against the trees with a relentless fury. Eldritch moved like a shadow, his eyes scanning the darkness, his senses heightened. He moved silently, his steps light on the wet ground, his breath steady despite the tension coiling within him. He knew the beast was out there, somewhere, lurking, watching. He had to draw it out, lead it back to the circle. But so far, he found nothing. No tracks, no scent, no sign of movement, just the unending rain and the shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly before him. Eldritch paused, listening to the wind, the rustle of leaves, the distant crack of a branch. He could feel the unease creeping in, the realization that the beast was more cunning than he had anticipated. "Where are you, you big bastard?" he muttered under his breath, frustration gnawing at him, but the woods remained silent, save for the storm. Meanwhile, Isolde moved swiftly through the forest, her senses alert, every nerve tingling with anticipation. Her long dark robes were drenched, clinging to her form, her hair plastered against her face by the driving rain. She knew the beast could smell her, that it would sense her presence and come for her. She could feel its hatred, its rage, a black, seething energy that seemed to pulse in the very air. She stepped over a fallen tree, her eyes scanning the darkness. "Come on," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Come for me." And then she felt it, a shift in the air, a prickle of dark energy that sent a shiver down her spine. The beast had caught her scent. A low, guttural howl echoed through the woods, a sound filled with pure, unrestrained fury. Isolde's heart quickened. She knew what was coming. From the shadows, the werewolf burst into view, its eyes glowing red, its massive form moving with terrifying speed. It lunged at her, its claws extended, fangs bared, a roar of rage tearing from its throat. Isolde threw up her hands, and a barrier of light flared into existence, a shimmering wall that deflected the beast's attack. The werewolf slammed into it with a bone-rattling force, snarling in frustration. It recoiled, its eyes narrowing, sensing her magic. "That's it," Isolde whispered, holding her ground, feeling the strain of the defensive spell tugging at her energy. "Come at me." The werewolf lunged again, faster this time, its claws scraping against the barrier, cracking it slightly. Isolde's hands trembled with the effort of maintaining the spell. She could feel the drain on her power, each second weakening her further, while the beast seemed to grow stronger, its anger feeding its strength. She gritted her teeth, her mind racing. She needed to lead it back to the stones, but the beast was relentless. Another attack, this one more vicious. The barrier flickered, and she felt her strength falter. "Not yet," she muttered, her voice strained. "Not here." With a flick of her wrist, she cast a flash spell, a burst of blinding light that filled the forest, illuminating every tree, every shadow. The werewolf howled in pain, its sensitive eyes dazzled, its movements halting for just a moment. Isolde didn't hesitate. She turned and sprinted back toward the stone circle, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind her, the werewolf shook off the spell's effects, its eyes burning with fury. It roared and took off after her, its massive paws thundering against the ground, tearing through the underbrush, snapping branches in its path. It moved like a force of nature, driven by pure hatred. Isolde ran, her feet slipping in the mud, branches tearing at her robes, her pulse racing. She could hear the beast gaining on her, its growls and snarls growing louder, closer. She pushed herself harder, the stone circle just ahead, the glow of the enchanted runes flickering in the rain. The chase was frantic, desperate. The rain pounded down, lightning flashing overhead, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the trees. Isolde could feel the beast's breath hot on her heels, could feel its hatred like a physical force pushing against her back. She reached the edge of the circle, skidding to a halt on the wet ground. She spun around, her hands raised, ready to cast another spell. The werewolf burst through the trees, its eyes blazing, its muscles tensed, its body coiled like a spring ready to strike. Isolde Blackthorn stood on the other side of the stones, her hands glowing with magic, her face pale but resolute. The beast paused for a fraction of a second, its eyes flicking to the runes, sensing the power in the air. It hesitated, wary, but its rage was too great, too consuming. With a roar, it charged at her, its claws outstretched, its fangs gleaming. As it crossed the threshold of the stone circle, a blinding light erupted from the sky, a column of pure energy that shot down from above, illuminating the entire clearing. The runes around the stones flared to life, glowing with a fierce, blinding intensity. The air crackled with power, the very ground trembling. Eldritch, watching from the shadows, saw the light and knew the trap had been sprung. He raced back toward the circle, moving with inhuman speed, his heart pounding in his chest. He arrived to see the werewolf caught within the stone circle, its massive form thrashing against the invisible chains that held it. The runes pulsed with energy, wrapping around the beast like tendrils of light, tightening with every struggle. Isolde stood on the other side of the circle, her face strained, her voice steady as she continued her incantation. "We must hurry," she said, her eyes meeting Eldritch's as he approached. "He is so strong, stronger than I feared." Eldritch nodded, stepping closer to the edge of the circle, feeling the power in the air, the intensity of the magic. "Let's do this," he said, his voice low but firm, "before it breaks free." Together, they prepared to finish the binding, knowing that this was their only chance. The werewolf roared, its eyes blazing with hatred, its body straining against the magical forces, holding it back. The final battle had begun. Eldritch and Isolde stood at the centre of the ancient stone circle, their breaths ragged, the tension between them almost tangible in the charged air. The runes around them blazed with a fierce, blinding light, the magic crackling and sparking like a living thing. The werewolf, caught within the barrier, thrashed violently, its growls reverberating through the air, a deep, guttural sound filled with rage and hatred. Isolde's voice rose above the storm, clear and commanding, as she began to chant an incantation that seemed to draw the very air around them inward, pulling at the edges of reality itself. Her hands moved in fluid, intricate patterns, summoning the spirits of the fallen lichens that still lingered near the stones. Bound by ancient oaths and rites, the spirits began to materialize, their forms misty and translucent, their eyes filled with a cold, vengeful light. "Come forth," Isolde commanded, her voice carrying an authority that resonated in the very bones of the earth. "Lend me your strength. Reclaim what was stolen from you." The spirits, sensing the presence of their ancient foe, began to swirl around the werewolf like a spectral wind, their forms solidifying, their faces twisted in anger. They moved with purpose, circling the beast, their hands reaching out like wisps of smoke, clawing at the air around the lichen. The werewolf roared, snapping at the spirits, its claws swiping through their incorporeal forms. But with each swipe, it seemed to lose a fraction of its strength, its movements becoming slightly more sluggish. The spirits, bound by their anger and pain, sought to reclaim the power that the beast had stolen from them, feeding off its very essence. Eldritch watched, his eyes wide, his face filled with a mix of hope and fear. "This could work," he muttered, feeling a spark of optimism. "We might actually..." But just as everything seemed to be going according to plan, Isolde suddenly screamed in pain, her incantation breaking off into a desperate gasp. She fell to her knees, clutching her side, blood seeping through her fingers. Standing behind her, a shadowy figure stepped forward, Mia, her eyes wild with a mix of triumph and madness, a bloodied knife gleaming in her hand. Maya's smile was feral, a gleam of satisfaction in her eyes. "Be free, my ancestor," she whispered, her voice dripping with venom. "Free to exact your revenge." Before Eldritch could react, Mia slipped back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as she had appeared. The magic that held the werewolf in place faltered, the glowing runes flickering and fading, the spirits dissipating like mist in the wind. The werewolf paused for a moment, sensing the change, and then it was free, standing tall and unchained in the centre of the stones. Isolde lay motionless on the ground, her face pale, her breath shallow. Eldritch glanced at her, fear clawing at his chest. "Isolde!" he called out, but she didn't move. The werewolf turned its gaze toward Eldritch, its eyes glowing with malice, its teeth bared in a snarling grin. Eldritch felt a chill run down his spine. "Oh dear," he muttered to himself, trying to sound nonchalant, despite the terror creeping up his throat. "Maybe I should have called winter after all." He knew he had to flee, but he also knew that leaving Isolde here would seal her fate. He was helpless against the werewolf. Engaging in a fight with a creature like this would be his demise. But he had to do something. He slipped into his shadow form, merging with the darkness, moving swiftly away from the beast. He emerged a few feet away, taunting it. "Not too bright, are we?" he called out, a mocking smile on his face. The werewolf snarled and lunged at him, but Eldritch slipped back into the shadows just in time, reappearing a few yards away. "Catch me if you can," he taunted again, trying to draw the beast further from Isolde. He repeated the maneuver, again and again, each time moving a little farther, luring the beast away from the stone circle. Eldritch's heart pounded in his chest. "I can't beat you," he said, a forced grin on his lips, "but I can send you on a wild goose chase." The werewolf growled in frustration, its eyes blazing, its focus fixed on Eldritch as he led it deeper into the woods, away from Isolde. But even as he did, he could feel the creature's anger growing, its movements becoming more erratic, more dangerous. He had to keep it distracted, keep it moving. Back at the stones, Isolde groaned in pain, her hand pressing against the deep wound in her back. She could feel the cold creeping in, the darkness edging into her vision. "That was our only chance," she whispered, her voice filled with despair. She managed to cast a small healing spell, feeling a slight relief from the pain, but it was far from enough. Eldritch emerged from the shadows again, hoping to lure the beast further, but the werewolf had vanished. He couldn't see it, couldn't hear it. "Damn," he muttered, his eyes darting around, searching the dark woods. He slipped back into the shadows and raced back to the stone circle in seconds. He found Isolde lying on the ground, her face twisted in pain. "You okay?" he asked, his voice urgent. "No," she replied, her voice weak. "It's bad." "Can't you heal it with a spell or something?" Eldritch asked, frustration creeping into his voice. Isolde shook her head, wincing. "It doesn't work that way," she said. "I need time to heal." Eldritch glanced around, his senses on high alert. "That's one thing we don't have," he said, his tone tense. "I lost him. He could be anywhere." They stood in the dark woods, their eyes scanning every shadow, every corner, every movement in the darkness. The rain poured down, the thunder rolled, and they could feel the fear settling in, the fear of not knowing where the beast was or when it would strike again. The rain continued to pour down in relentless sheets, the storm's fury undiminished. Isolde leaned heavily against one of the ancient stones, her face pale and her breathing laboured. The wound on her back still throbbed with pain, but she remained focused, her senses alert to every sound, every flicker of movement in the shadows around them. "Maybe it's time to call your friend," she said, her voice strained but determined. Eldritch glanced back at her, concern etched across his features. "I will try, but will you be safe?" he asked. Isolde nodded, her expression firm despite the pain. "I can conceal myself. The beast may be able to track my scent, but I should be fine. Just hurry." With a final nod, Eldritch stepped into the shadows, invoking his unique elder ability to traverse great distances by merging with the darkness. The world blurred around him, the storm and the forest melting away into a dark, swirling void. In mere seconds, he reappeared at the entrance of Winter's estate, the grand structure looming against the stormy sky. Eldritch rushed to the heavy wooden door and raised his hand to knock, but before he could, the door swung open. Standing in the doorway was Mara, a woman in her late 40s, with short brown hair and sharp brown eyes that immediately fixed on him with a mixture of surprise and concern. "Eldritch, is that you?" she asked, her tone a mix of surprise and caution. "Yes, it's me," Eldritch replied urgently. "I have little time, Mara. I need Winter." Mara's expression shifted to one of worry. "Winter's off holding back some demon from breaching reality. I don't know when he'll be back," she explained. Eldritch's face tightened with frustration. "The Alpha?" he asked, his voice edged with urgency. "He's with him," Mara confirmed, her voice steady but apologetic. Eldritch cursed under his breath, a low growl of frustration escaping his lips. "Damn it, Mara. This is urgent. I have to go. I'll need to find another way," he muttered, turning to leave. "Wait," Mara called out, catching his arm. "You know, he's still in the den," she said, a glint of mischief in her eyes. "Simon thinks he's too unstable to help, but I'm sure he'd want to. might be your best bet." Eldritch hesitated. "You're sure he won't kill me?" he asked, half joking, half serious. Mara shrugged with a wry smile. "No, but I think he likes you." Eldritch nodded, taking a deep breath before heading towards the den, a dark, cavernous space beneath the estate where the most dangerous and unpredictable werewolves were kept under Simon's watchful eye. He descended into the shadows cautiously, his senses sharp. "You in here, Dimitri? Duke, or whatever you'd like me to call you," he called out, his voice echoing in the dim, humid space. "Sir, if you prefer, but I really could use your help." The ground trembled slightly as massive footsteps approached. Each step making the stone walls shudder. From the darkness emerged Dimitri, the Alpha Prime, a towering figure of raw primal power. His fur was as dark as midnight, his eyes glowing a fierce yellow, filled with an untamed and feral intelligence. Eldritch felt a wave of fear surge up his spine, his fingers twitching slightly at his sides. "Ah, Dimitri, so great to see you," Eldritch stammered, forcing a smile despite the terror gripping his chest. "I have this little issue, you see. Seems another lichen, a big one, wants to kill me. Can't imagine why. And well, I know you're the Alpha, the Lichen Prime. I could use your assistance." Dimitri's eyes bore into Eldritch's, and after a tense moment, the massive lichen gave a slow, deliberate nod. Eldritch exhaled in relief. "I'll have to take you into the shadows to get there," he said cautiously, stepping closer. Dimitri nodded again, his enormous form looming over Eldritch, his presence radiating a powerful authority. Eldritch reached out and touched Dimitri's arm, feeling the raw strength coursing through him. Concentrating, he merged them both into the shadows, the darkness enveloping them as they travelled back to the stones in a matter of seconds. They emerged at the edge of the stone circle, the storm still raging around them, lightning splitting the sky. Eldritch stumbled slightly, but Dimitri stood tall, his piercing yellow eyes scanning the area with a predatory gaze. Isolde looked up, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of the massive Lichen Prime. She straightened herself, despite the pain. This is who can stop the beast?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Another beast? We could end up fighting two instead of one." Eldritch raised a calming hand. "Wait, this is the Alpha Prime. He's not just another beast. He's the Lichen Prime. He will help us." Isolde's eyes flicked between Eldritch and Dimitri, uncertainty still evident in her expression. She knew there was no time to debate. The rogue Lichen was somewhere out there, and if Dimitri was their best hope, she had to trust Eldritch's judgment. Dimitri stepped forward, his immense frame casting a shadow over the stone circle, his presence radiating power and dominance. Eldritch felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. They had brought back a force that might just be enough to confront the rogue Lichen, a force with the strength of the original Alpha's bloodline. As the storm raged on, the Alpha Prime stood tall in the center of the stone circle, ready to face the battle that was to come. The storm raged on, rain pouring down like a relentless curtain from the heavens, lightning crackling across the darkened sky. Dimitri, the Alpha Prime, stood still for a moment, his massive form tense, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air, his yellow eyes narrowing to slits. The scent of the rogue lichen, mingled with rain and earth, filled his senses, igniting a primal instinct deep within him. With a low, rumbling growl, Dimitri glanced at Eldritch, his gaze intense and almost challenging. Eldritch felt a shiver run down his spine, understanding the unspoken command. Before Eldritch could speak, Dimitri darted off into the dark woods, a blur of speed and raw power. "I think he wants us to wait here," Eldritch murmured, watching as Dimitri vanished into the shadows, his heart pounding. He turned to Isolde, who was still leaning against the stones, her wound barely held at bay by her magic. Isolde nodded, her face tense. "Let's hope he knows what he's doing," she whispered, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond the stone circle. Dimitri moved through the dark, rain-soaked forest like a spectre, his movements swift and silent, his senses heightened to their fullest. He was an ancient, powerful beast, the Alpha Prime, father to Winter's own Alpha. His story was one of legend, filled with blood and darkness, from his cursed beginnings to the havoc he had wrought upon mankind. In a different reality, Dimitri had unleashed an apocalypse on the world of men, leading the Lycans in a war that nearly brought about the end of humanity. He had revelled in the carnage, in the fear and chaos, fulfilling the primal rage that burned within him. But that reality had been reset, undone by Winter's power, and Dimitri had found a new path. He had joined Winter and his son, Winter's Alpha, knowing happiness and peace for the first time in his long, brutal existence. Yet the primal force within him, the need to be an Alpha, had never been fully tamed. Today, that ancient hunger stirred again, and perhaps this day would see Dimitri reclaim his true nature, become the Alpha once more. The forest around him seemed to shrink back in fear as he passed, the rain hissing against his fur, the lightning illuminating his dark, formidable form. He moved like a shadow, his eyes scanning the darkness, his ears pricked for any sound, any sign of his prey. The scent of the rogue lichen was growing stronger, sharper, filled with rage and defiance. Dimitri's lips curled back into a snarl. He could sense the creature's challenge, its desire to dominate, to overthrow him. The darkness was thick, almost tangible, the storm muffling sound and obscuring sight. Dimitri moved with purpose, his muscles coiled and ready, his mind focused on the hunt. This rogue lichen was different. It did not recognize his authority, did not bow to his command. It sought to take his place as the Alpha, to challenge him in a way no other lichen had dared. Dimitri's primal instincts flared, and a low growl rumbled deep in his throat. He could feel the old rage boiling to the surface, the bloodlust that had driven him to war and destruction so many centuries ago. The forest seemed to vibrate with his presence, the rain falling harder, the thunder rumbling louder, as if the very elements sensed the confrontation that was about to unfold. Then, in the darkness ahead, he caught a flicker of movement. His sharp eyes focused, his ears twitched, and he saw the rogue lichen. It was massive, almost matching Dimitri in size, its fur bristling with fury, its eyes glowing with a fierce, unnatural light. The rogue had sensed him, picking up his scent on the wind. They stood across from each other in the dark, the rain pouring between them, steam rising from their heated breath. Dimitri let out a deafening roar, a command that all lichens should obey. His voice was like thunder, echoing through the trees, a proclamation of his dominance. He was the Alpha Prime, the original, the father of all lichens. In his presence, they should submit, bow, or flee. But the rogue lichen did not bow. Its lips curled back into a snarl, revealing long, jagged teeth, its eyes filled with a burning defiance. This lichen was different. It would not obey. It sought dominance over all things, even the Alpha Prime. It wanted to take Dimitri's place, to claim his title, to be the alpha above all. Dimitri's eyes narrowed, a deep, guttural growl emanating from his chest. He could see the madness in the rogue's eyes, the consuming desire for power. This was not just a hunt. This was a challenge, an attempt to overthrow him, to claim what had always been his. The rogue lichen lunged forward, its muscles rippling under its matted fur, its claws extended, its teeth bared. Dimitri crouched low, his own claws digging into the wet earth, his muscles tensing for the inevitable clash. He roared again, louder this time, his voice filled with both anger and authority. He would not allow this upstart to take what was his. The two lichens met in a flurry of fur, teeth, and claws, the impact sending shockwaves through the forest floor. Dimitri's strength was immense, his movements fluid and controlled, but the rogue was fast, agile, driven by an insatiable hunger for dominance. They clashed again and again, each strike sending echoes through the trees, the storm raging around them as if responding to their fury. Dimitri's mind was clear, focused, the old instincts coming back with every blow, every dodge. He was the Alpha Prime, and he would not be defeated. But he could see the rogue's determination, its refusal to submit. This was no ordinary lichen. It was something more, something that should not exist, and it would not stop until one of them lay dead. Dimitri bared his teeth, his eyes blazing in the darkness. The rogue lichen snarled, its eyes burning with hatred and ambition, and charged again. Dimitri braced himself, knowing that this battle would not end quickly, that it might be the fight that defined his existence. The storm raged on, lightning flashing, illuminating the two massive figures locked in combat, the primal battle between Alpha and Usurper. The two beasts faced each other, their eyes locked in a primal challenge. Dimitri, the Alpha Prime, could sense something different, something unsettling about this rogue lichen before him. This was no ordinary werewolf. It was something darker, something twisted by an unnatural power. Dimitri's instincts flared, sensing the malevolent energy that radiated from the creature. The rogue werewolf had absorbed the powers of its own pack to enhance its strength, drawing their essence into itself. The darkness had sent the beast deep into the arms of evil, its soul tainted by the power it had consumed. Dimitri could feel the corruption that lay within it, a monstrous force that had become something more than just a mere werewolf. Centuries ago, this rogue had been known as Malakar, a warlock with a dark heart, who had once crossed paths with Isolde. Obsessed with power, Malakar had sought a way to transcend his mortal limits. He had allowed himself to be bitten by another lichen, deliberately taking on the curse. But Malakar was no ordinary man. He had woven a spell around himself, a curse upon a curse, allowing him to absorb the powers of any lichen he felled, their strength and abilities feeding his own. Now he stood before Dimitri, hungering for the ultimate prize, the power of the Alpha Prime. Malakar's eyes glinted with malevolent ambition, and Dimitri knew that the rogue would not stop until he had claimed his place as the new Alpha. The two werewolves lunged at each other, a violent collision of fur, claws, and teeth. The ground beneath them trembled with the force of their clash. Dimitri's muscles strained as he pushed back against the rogue lichen's assault, but he could feel the power coursing through Malakar, a strength that seemed to swell with every strike. Malakar had the strength of many lichens within him, and with each blow he drew on their combined might. The rogue werewolf fought with a relentless fury, his blows coming harder and faster, driving Dimitri back. Dimitri could feel the difference. Malakar was using the power he had stolen from countless lichens, drawing on their strength to overwhelm him. For a moment, Dimitri felt his own strength faltering, the weight of Malakar's power pressing down on him like a crushing wave. But then Dimitri felt it. Something deep within himself, a stirring, an ancient force that awakened in his core. He realized that no single lichen could deny the call of the Alpha Prime, whether living or dead. Malakar had consumed their strength, but he had not accounted for the primal connection that bound all lichens to their true Alpha. Dimitri threw back his head and let out a howl that cut through the storm. A primal call that echoed across the forest, reaching into the very essence of every lichen soul, commanding them to obey. It was a call that no werewolf could deny, a summons from the Alpha Prime that reverberated through the fabric of existence itself. One by one, Dimitri could feel the souls of the lichens trapped within Malakar begin to stir, struggling against the dark magic that bound them. The rogue werewolf's body jerked and convulsed, his eyes wide with surprise and fear as he felt his control slipping. The power within him began to wane, the stolen strength starting to ebb away. Malakar growled in desperation, trying to hold on to the power he had taken, but it was no use. The souls of the lichens began to wrestle free, tearing themselves away from the rogue's grasp, their essence responding to Dimitri's call. With each soul that broke free, Malakar weakened, his form shrinking, his strength fading. Finally, the last of the stolen power left Malakar's body, and he stood before Dimitri as nothing more than an ordinary werewolf, panting and blooded, his eyes wide with fear. Dimitri towered over him, his claws raised, ready to strike. Rage burned in his heart, rage for the lives Malakar had destroyed, for the evil he had wrought, for the defiance against the natural order. He could end this here and now, destroy Malakar for what he had done. But then, a memory surged through Dimitri's mind, a memory from long ago that made his heart falter. The memory. The vision took Dimitri back to that fateful night when he had first transformed into the Alpha, consumed by grief and fury. It was the night when he had lost Elena, the woman he loved, brutally murdered by those who had hunted him, those who had wronged him. The pain was unbearable, a fire that burned through his soul, fueling his transformation into something monstrous. He remembered the way his heart had pounded in his chest, the primal scream that tore from his throat as his body convulsed, bones breaking and reforming, fur sprouting from his skin, the raw power that surged through him as he became the Alpha for the first time, an unstoppable force, driven by a singular desire for revenge. He had torn through the village, his senses overwhelmed by the scent of blood and fear. His vision had turned red with rage as he hunted down those responsible, one by one, leaving a trail of devastation in his wake. In those moments, Dimitri had become the very embodiment of primal hatred, a beast with no thought beyond his thirst for vengeance. The screams of the villagers, the crackle of flames as homes burned, the splatter of blood on his claws, these memories surged back with vivid clarity. He remembered the feeling of satisfaction as he watched the life drain from his enemies, the way the rage within him had seemed insatiable, even after the last of his foes had fallen. Yet, as the bloodlust ebbed, what remained was a hollow emptiness. The vengeance he had sought had not brought him peace. Instead, it had only deepened his sorrow, trapping him in a cycle of rage and regret. He had become the very monster they had feared, a vessel of primal hatred that knew no bounds. Returned to the present, Dimitri's gaze softened as he stared down at the rogue werewolf beneath him. He could see the same madness in Malakar's eyes, the same torment that had once driven him. In that moment, Dimitri saw not just an enemy, but a reflection of his own tortured soul, a being lost to the very curse that had consumed them both. His claws hovered inches from Malakar's throat, trembling as the memory of his own past washed over him. Dimitri's heart pounded in his chest, but now it was with a different emotion, an emotion he had not felt in centuries. Compassion. The primal rage that had driven him moments before began to wane, replaced by a deep sense of understanding. Dimitri saw that it was not the beast, but the man, the evil warlock, who had enslaved this creature for his own gain. The beast was the one who had been caged by the warlock's dark magic. The flashback faded, and Dimitri found himself back in the present. He withdrew his claws, stepping back from the rogue werewolf, his mind racing with the weight of his decision. Malachar, panting and bloodied, stared up at him in confusion, the hatred in his eyes flickering with uncertainty. Dimitri, breathing heavily, howled, a primal call to banish the man and free the beast within Malachar. It was a howl that resonated deep within the rogue werewolf, awakening the beast and purging the warlock's dark influence. A brief, fierce battle raged within Malachar's soul, but the alpha's call was too strong. Slowly, the warlock's spirit was cast out, leaving only the beast behind, a creature loyal to the Alpha Prime. For the first time in centuries, Dimitri chose mercy over vengeance, not out of weakness, but out of the wisdom hard-earned through his own suffering. As he stood over the defeated werewolf, Dimitri realized that breaking the cycle of hatred was the only way to find redemption for them both. The battle was over, but the true challenge had only just begun. Dimitri knew that sparing Malachar would change everything, but it was a risk he was finally willing to take for himself, for Malachar, and for the hope of a different future. Dimitri emerged from the darkness of the forest into the clearing of the stone circle, his massive form silhouetted against the dim light of the stormy sky. The rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle, and the air was thick with the scent of wet earth and ozone. Eldritch and Isolde stood by the ancient stones, their faces tense, waiting for news of the battle. Eldritch's eyes widened as he saw the Alpha Prime approach, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. "What happened?" Eldritch shouted, his voice edged with both concern and urgency. Before Dimitri could respond, another figure appeared from the shadows behind him, the rogue werewolf, its eyes lowered, its posture submissive. Eldritch and Isolde tensed, their bodies immediately ready for a fight. But Dimitri, sensing their alarm, let out a low, rumbling growl, a sound that cut through the tension like a knife. The rogue werewolf immediately bowed its head, its ears flattening against its skull, its body crouching low in a posture of submission. It made no move to attack, no sign of aggression. Isolde's eyes narrowed, but she could feel the change in the air, the shift in the creature's aura. She lowered her hands slowly, the glow fading as she realized what had occurred. "The warlock, he's gone," she murmured, sensing the absence of the dark presence that had once inhabited the werewolf. Eldritch, still wary. "So, it's over?" he asked, his voice quieter now, searching Dimitri's face for confirmation. Dimitri gave a curt nod, and then turned to the werewolf beside him. The creature remained in its submissive stance, showing no signs of resistance or rebellion. Dimitri let out another low growl, more of a rumble in his chest, and the werewolf responded by lowering itself even further, its head almost touching the ground, a gesture of loyalty and respect to the Alpha Prime. Isolde stepped forward, her eyes softening as she looked at Dimitri. "You spared him," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of surprise and understanding. "You broke the cycle." Dimitri nodded again, his expression calm but firm, his eyes meeting hers with a depth of emotion rarely seen. A silence fell over the clearing, the rain now just a soft whisper against the leaves. Eldritch, exhaling a breath he hadn't realised he'd been holding. "Well, I suppose that's that," he said, trying to mask his relief with a casual tone. "You heading back to your den with your new recruit?" Dimitri glanced at the werewolf beside him, who remained in its humble stance, and then gave a short nod. Isolde smiled, a gentle warmth in her expression. "Good," she said. "He deserves a chance, just like anyone else." Dimitri inclined his head toward her in a respectful nod. Eldritch turned to Isolde, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "So, I suppose this is where we part ways," he said, his tone lighter. "Back to my own shadows, I guess." Isolde chuckled softly. "Not quite," she replied. "I think I'll stick around this timeline a bit longer. I find I like the company." Eldritch raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Well, I can't say I blame you," he said with a grin. "This timeline does have its moments." They exchanged a nod, a silent understanding passing between them. Isolde knew that the future was uncertain, but she felt a sense of peace, a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years. Dimitri turned, leading the rogue werewolf away from the clearing, back toward the dense woods where his den lay hidden among the shadows. The werewolf followed obediently, its head still bowed, its posture respectful. For the first time in centuries, Dimitri felt a sense of calm settle over him, a quiet resolution that soothed the turmoil in his soul. He had chosen a different path, one that did not lead to vengeance or hatred, but to understanding and change. And as the Alpha Prime, he knew that this decision would echo through the generations of lichens that followed, a reminder that even the fiercest of beasts could choose mercy over rage. Eldritch watched them go, then turned back to Isolde. "Well," he said with a sigh, "I guess we should get out of this rain." Isolde smiled. "Yes, let's..." As they walked away from the ancient stones, the rain began to taper off, and a sliver of moonlight broke through the clouds. The storm had passed, and with it, a new chapter had begun, for them all. And so, they moved forward, leaving the shadows of the past behind, stepping into whatever light the future might bring. Epilogue. A shadow in the night. The city was quiet under the cover of darkness, the streets slick with recent rain, the only sounds the distant hum of traffic and the occasional drip of water from the rooftops. In a small, cramped apartment, a woman frantically stuffed belongings into a backpack, her hands trembling as she glanced nervously at the clock on the wall. She moved with urgency, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She knew she needed to leave, and fast. Pulling on a worn jacket, she grabbed her keys and darted out the door, descending the stairs 2 at a time. The night air was cold as she stepped outside, her footsteps echoing in the narrow alleyway. She hurried toward her car, parked under a flickering street lamp, the shadows around her seeming to pulse with a life of their own. She slipped into the driver's seat, her hands shaking as she jammed the key into the ignition. She turned it, but nothing happened. The engine sputtered, then fell silent. "Damn it!" she hissed, pounding the steering wheel in frustration. Her heart pounded in her chest, her eyes darting around, searching the dark street. Then, in the distance, she saw it. A figure, dark and shadowy, standing just beyond the circle of light cast by the street lamp. Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't make out any features, only the silhouette, a tall, menacing form that seemed to be watching her. Fear gripped her. She threw open the car door and bolted, her feet slapping against the wet pavement. She ran blindly, her breath coming in desperate gasps, her mind racing. The shadow figure moved, gliding silently, effortlessly in pursuit. The city seemed to close in around her, the buildings tall and foreboding, the alleys twisting into a maze. She could hear her own heartbeat, loud in her ears, feel the cold air biting at her skin. She glanced back, her eyes wide with terror, and saw the figure still following, gaining ground. She turned a corner, skidding slightly on the wet pavement, and found herself in a narrow alley, a dead end looming ahead. Her eyes darted around, searching for a way out, but there was none. She was trapped. She turned, for the first time revealing her face in the dim light. It was Mia. Her eyes were wide with fear, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "No, no," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I was just respecting my ancestors." The shadow figure stepped forward, emerging from the darkness with a quiet, predatory grace. Eldritch. His face was impassive, his eyes dark and cold. He took a slow step toward her, his presence filling the narrow alleyway with a suffocating sense of menace. "Yes," he said softly, his voice carrying an edge of cold amusement. "I've heard it so many times. I was just following orders." Mia's face twisted with fear, her eyes darting for any escape, but there was none. The darkness seemed to close in around her, the shadow of Eldritch looming larger, his expression unchanging, relentless. The lights of the city stretching out into the distance. Then, a piercing scream echoed through the night. Chilling, desperate, and then silence.